The story of the Moors begins long before they were known by that name, in the landscapes of North Africa where geography, culture and shifting empires created a foundation that would later define their identity. The earliest layers of this history belong to the indigenous Berber peoples, who occupied the vast stretches of the Maghreb from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the edge of Cyrenaica in modern Libya. These Berber communities, also known in antiquity as the Libyans or Mori, were not a single people but a mosaic of tribes connected by shared language routes and a network of traditions that adapted to the rugged terrains of mountains, deserts and coastal plains. Their way of life had developed over millennia, blending pastoral nomadism with agricultural settlement and creating social systems resilient to the harsh climates of the Sahara and Atlas ranges. The earliest glimpses of these populations come from Egyptian records describing Libyan tribes on their western frontiers, where conflicts and exchanges of goods linked the Nile world to the communities beyond the desert. Greek sources later described the peoples inhabiting what they called Mauritania and Numidia, lands stretching across North Africa that were rich in resources but difficult to dominate completely. Carthage rose on the North African coast in the first millennium BCE as a Phoenician outpost, and its expansion into a powerful maritime empire brought Berber peoples into contact with the wider Mediterranean world. Many Berber tribes alternated between resisting Carthaginian domination and serving as allies or mercenaries in its armies. This long tradition of shifting allegiances and cultural negotiation would persist throughout their history, setting the stage for the later Moorish synthesis. Roman expansion into North Africa altered this landscape further. After the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, Rome absorbed much of the Carthaginian territory, bringing parts of the Berber world under imperial control. The creation of the provinces of Africa, Proconsularis, Numidia, and later Mauritania extended Roman authority deep into the Maghreb, though not without persistent challenges. In many areas, Rome preferred to rely on local Berber kings who acted as client rulers, maintaining a measure of autonomy while acknowledging Roman supremacy. Figures such as King Juba II of Mauritania illustrate this dynamic. Educated in Rome, married to Cleopatra Selene, and deeply involved in cultural exchange, he represented a blending of African and Mediterranean traditions that would foreshadow the hybrid identities of the Moors centuries later. Roman presence brought roads, cities and monumental architecture, transforming parts of North Africa into some of the most prosperous provinces of the empire. Carthage was rebuilt as a Roman colony and became one of the largest cities of the Roman world. The fertile farmlands of Tunisia and Algeria supplied grain, olive oil, and other products vital to the empire. Cities like Timgad, Leptis Magna, and Volubilis display the grandeur of Roman urban planning transplanted onto African soil. Yet even as Roman culture penetrated the region, Berber traditions remained vital. Many communities in the mountains and deserts retained their languages, tribal structures and customs, interacting with Rome on their own terms. Periodic rebellions, such as those led by Tacfarinas in the early 1st century CE, demonstrated the limits of Roman control and the resilience of indigenous identity. Religion reflected this duality. Roman gods stood in temples alongside Berber deities, and Christianity spread through the region in the later centuries of empire. North Africa produced influential figures such as Tertullian, Cyprian and Augustine of Hippo, whose writings would shape Christian theology for centuries. But alongside this Christian tradition, Berber spiritual practices persisted, adapting to new contexts without disappearing entirely. The layering of traditions created a cultural depth that would later merge with the forces of Islam to produce something distinctively Moorish. By the time the Western Roman Empire began to collapse in the 5th century, North Africa had already developed a mixed identity shaped by centuries of imperial integration. The Vandals, a Germanic people who crossed from Spain into Africa around 429 CE, carved out a kingdom that lasted nearly a century, ruling from Carthage and disrupting Roman authority. Their presence was brief in the long span of history, but it marked another phase of cultural interaction. The Vandals were Arians, a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the Catholic majority, and their rule introduced new tensions into North African society. In 533 CE, the Byzantine Empire launched a reconquest, restoring imperial control for another century and a half. Yet Byzantine power never penetrated deeply into the Berber interior, where tribal confederations grew stronger and more autonomous. These Berber groups developed complex political and military structures, sometimes allying with the Byzantines, sometimes resisting. Leaders like Kahina, a Berber queen of the later 7th century, symbolized this resilience and capacity for leadership that challenged outside powers. By this period, the Maghreb was already a frontier zone where Roman and Byzantine legacies overlapped with older Berber traditions, and the stage was set for a profound transformation that would come from the east with the rise of Islam. The Arab conquest of the 7th century reshaped the Maghreb permanently. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Muslim armies rapidly expanded across the Middle East and into North Africa. The conquest of Egypt under Amr ibn al-As opened the way westward, and successive campaigns pushed into Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and beyond. Resistance was fierce, with Berber tribes mounting strong defences of their territories, but over decades of conflict and negotiation the Islamic presence spread. By the early 8th century, the process of Islamization and Arabization had begun to integrate North Africa into the emerging Islamic world. For the Berbers, the arrival of Islam was not simply an imposition, but a new framework that could be adapted to their own traditions. Many converted to Islam, adopting Arabic as a language of religion and administration, but Berber languages and identities remained strong. Islam provided a unifying ideology that transcended tribal divisions, allowing for larger political coalitions, but it also offered spiritual and legal systems that could blend with existing customs. This synthesis produced the foundations of what would later be recognized as Moorish identity, an identity rooted in both African and Islamic traditions, shaped by centuries of contact with the Mediterranean world and prepared for expansion into Iberia. The Islamic conquest of North Africa was not purely a military matter. It involved social and cultural transformation as new cities arose, trade routes expanded, and religious institutions took root. Kairouan, founded in present-day Tunisia, became a major centre of Islamic learning and authority in the West. Mosques, schools, and courts established the presence of the new faith, while merchants connected the Maghreb more firmly to networks stretching from the Middle East to sub-Saharan Africa. These developments positioned the Berber and Arab peoples of North Africa as crucial intermediaries between different worlds, a role that would only grow more significant with the crossing into Iberia. The fusion of Berber resilience and Arab religious authority created a powerful force. When Tariq ibn Ziyad led his troops across the strait in 711 CE, his army consisted largely of Berber soldiers recently integrated into the Islamic world. They carried with them not only the banner of Islam, but also the legacy of centuries of cultural adaptation in North Africa. Their identity was not a simple reflection of Arab conquerors, but a hybrid, and it was this hybridity that allowed the Moors to create something unique in Iberia. Before they were called Moors in European chronicles, they were Berbers and Arabs, Muslims and North Africans, inheritors of Carthage and Rome, products of Byzantine conflict and tribal resilience. Their origins were complex, layered and dynamic. This complexity would define their history in Spain and beyond, for they carried with them not a single tradition, but a mosaic, and it was this mosaic that would allow them to build a civilization of extraordinary richness across the strait in Al-Andalus. As the identity of the Moors begins to form in the landscapes of North Africa, one cannot overlook the central role of the Berber tribes and the legacy left by Rome in the region once known as Mauritania. This land, stretching across modern Morocco and parts of Algeria, occupied a crucial position at the far western edge of the Mediterranean world. It was both a frontier and a crossroads, where desert, ocean and mountain converged, and where waves of influence from Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans and later Byzantines continually pressed against deeply rooted tribal traditions. The Berbers of Mauritania were not passive recipients of these influences, nor were they isolated. They were active participants in a process of adaptation and negotiation that would shape their identity and leave enduring marks on the history of the Western Mediterranean. The Berbers themselves were a diverse collection of tribes spread across a vast geography. Some dwelled in the fertile coastal plains, practicing settled agriculture and forming alliances with urban centres. Others roamed the mountain ranges of the Rif and the Atlas, pastoralists moving herds through seasonal cycles. Still others braved the edges of the Sahara, controlling caravan routes that carried salt, gold, slaves, and ideas between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. This diversity meant that the Berbers could never be described as a single unified people, but their shared languages and cultural practices created threads of commonality. Their political organisation was often tribal, based on kinship networks and local leadership, yet at various times confederations emerged under strong leaders who could rally multiple groups to resist external threats or exploit opportunities. Mauritania entered the consciousness of the Mediterranean world through its connections with Carthage and later Rome. The Phoenician colonists who founded Carthage in the 9th century BCE established trading posts along the Moroccan coast, integrating Berber communities into Mediterranean commerce. In time, Carthage exerted political and military influence inland, though rarely in ways that completely subdued Berber independence. Many Berbers served as allies or mercenaries in Carthaginian armies, gaining military experience that would later prove useful when new powers arrived. Hannibal's famous campaigns in Italy included large numbers of Berber cavalry, renowned for their speed and ferocity. Rome's eventual victory over Carthage and expansion into North Africa brought Mauritania into the imperial orbit. In 33 BCE, the Kingdom of Mauritania became a Roman client state under King Juba II, who had been raised in Rome after the defeat of his father Juba of Numidia. Juba II's reign represents one of the most striking examples of cultural blending in antiquity. Educated in Roman traditions, married to Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, Juba embodied the synthesis of African, Roman and Hellenistic influences. He ruled from the capital at Caesarea, modern Churchill in Algeria, fostering a court where Roman architecture, literature and customs mixed with local traditions. Juba II sponsored scholarship and exploration, commissioning works on geography and natural history, and encouraging maritime voyages along the Atlantic coast of Africa. His reign stabilised Mauritania while aligning it firmly with Roman interests. This period illustrates how Roman influence could merge with Berber traditions without erasing them. The kingdom retained local elements of governance and culture, even as it displayed Roman monuments and adopted Roman law. For Rome, this arrangement provided security on its western frontier and access to the resources of the region without requiring direct conquest. For the Berbers, it offered opportunities for advancement within imperial structures while preserving a degree of autonomy. The incorporation of Mauritania into the Roman Empire in 44 CE, following the assassination of Juba's son Ptolemy, marked a new phase. The territory was divided into Mauritania Tingitana in the west and Mauritania Tazariensis in the east, each governed as a province. Roman forts, roads and cities spread across the region, though the intensity of Romanization varied. In Tingitana, centred on the city of Tingis, modern Tangier, the proximity to Spain and integration into Mediterranean trade fostered deeper Roman influence. In Caesariensis, the coastal cities flourished under Roman administration, but the mountainous and desert hinterlands remained largely under Berber control. Roman rule left visible marks in stone and infrastructure. Towns like Volubilis displayed Roman urban planning with forums, basilicas, baths and temples. Latin inscriptions appeared across the region, evidence of administrative integration. Agricultural estates exploited fertile lands, producing grain, olives, and wine for export to Rome. The region became particularly noted for its purple dye, extracted from murex shells along the coast, a luxury product highly prized across the empire. Roman military presence, while not as extensive as in other provinces, ensured order in key areas and protected trade routes. Yet the limits of Roman control were clear. Beyond the lines of forts and the reach of garrisons, Berber tribes maintained independence, sometimes raiding Roman territories, sometimes trading peacefully. The interaction between Rome and the Berbers was not one of complete domination, but rather a constant negotiation. Some tribes allied with Rome, providing soldiers for imperial campaigns. Berber cavalry units were famous throughout the empire, serving in distant provinces from Britain to the Danube frontier. Their mobility and skill made them invaluable in warfare, and their presence in Roman armies facilitated cultural exchange, bringing Berber soldiers into contact with diverse peoples across the empire. Other tribes resisted Roman authority, launching periodic uprisings that tested the resilience of imperial control. Religious life in Mauritania reflected this blending of traditions. Roman gods and imperial cult rituals found a place in urban centres where temples dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva stood alongside altars to local deities. Saturn, in particular, became a syncretic figure, merging aspects of a Roman god with pre-Roman African traditions. Christianity also took root in the later centuries of Roman rule, spreading through cities and into some Berber communities. Bishops from Mauritania attended church councils, and Christian inscriptions appear in archaeological records. Yet traditional Berber religious practices persisted, particularly in rural and tribal settings, demonstrating the coexistence of multiple belief systems. The decline of Roman authority in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE exposed the fragility of imperial control in Mauritania. Political instability in Rome, coupled with external pressures from Germanic invasions and internal economic difficulties, reduced the resources available to maintain strong garrisons in North Africa. As a result, Berber tribes reasserted greater independence, expanding into areas once firmly under Roman influence. The balance of power shifted, though Roman cities and settlements remained active centres of trade and culture. The Vandal conquest of North Africa in the 5th century further weakened Roman legacy in the region. While the Vandals concentrated their power in Tunisia and eastern Algeria, Mauritania became a zone of fragmented authority. Berber leaders carved out independent kingdoms, blending Roman administrative practices with tribal traditions. These polities demonstrate the durability of Roman influence even after the empire's collapse. Berber rulers adopted Latin titles, minted coins, and employed elements of Roman law, showing how deeply imperial systems had penetrated local society. Yet at the same time, tribal structures and indigenous customs ensured that these post-Roman states were not mere continuations of empire, but distinct expressions of African identity. The Byzantine Reconquest under Justinian in the 6th century attempted to restore imperial order, but its success in Mauritania was limited. Byzantine control was largely confined to coastal enclaves, with the interior dominated by Berber confederations. This period reinforced the pattern that had defined Mauritania for centuries. External powers might control the cities and trade routes, but the hinterlands remained Berber, resilient and adaptive. The Roman legacy in Mauritania was therefore complex. It left behind cities, roads, laws, and a measure of cultural Romanization, especially in urban elites. It integrated the region into the economic and political systems of the Mediterranean world, shaping identities and practices that persisted long after Rome itself had fallen. At the same time, it never extinguished Berber autonomy, which continued to reassert itself whenever imperial authority weakened. The interaction between Berber traditions and Roman legacies created a layered identity. one that would later merge with the transformative forces of Islam to produce the civilization known as Moorish. This background explains why the Moors were not simply Arabs who arrived in Spain after 711, but rather a people deeply rooted in North Africa's ancient history. They carried with them the memory of Berber resilience, the experience of centuries of contact with Rome, and the cultural practices forged in Mauritania's unique environment. The foundations laid during this period ensured that when the Arab conquest brought Islam to the Maghreb, the Berbers of Mauritania could absorb and adapt the new faith in ways that reflected their own history. From this blending emerged the community that would cross into Iberia, but before that, crossing the transformation of the Maghreb through Islamization must be understood. The Roman legacy remained a shadow in the background, visible in ruins and traditions, but the arrival of Islam provided a new unifying framework that would reshape everything. The Berbers of Mauritania, heirs to centuries of negotiation with empires, would soon encounter the most powerful force yet in the expanding Islamic Caliphate, and in that encounter they would take on the identity that history remembers as Moorish. The story of North Africa turned a decisive corner in the 7th century when the armies of Islam, newly energized by the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad and the expansionist ambitions of the early Caliphate, reached the Maghreb. What had been a region shaped for centuries by Berber resilience, Carthaginian trade, Roman order, and Byzantine enclaves, now faced a new power whose spiritual message and political structures carried the potential to transform the entire cultural landscape. The Arab conquests were not a single sweeping movement that instantly subjugated the Maghreb. Instead, they unfolded through decades of campaigns, negotiations, rebellions, and accommodations. Islam spread not simply through the sword, but through a complex process of persuasion, adaptation, and synthesis with existing Berber traditions. By the early 8th century, the Maghreb had become integrated into the Islamic world, and from this transformation emerged the foundation of Moorish identity that would shape history in both Africa and Iberia. The first Arab incursions into North Africa began soon after the conquest of Egypt. Amr ibn al-As, the general who secured Egypt for the Caliphate in the 640s, pushed further west into Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. These territories, long tied to Roman and Byzantine rule, were strategically important for controlling trade routes and securing the frontier of the new Islamic Empire. Initial campaigns encountered relatively light resistance, as Byzantine authority was thin in these areas, but the further the Arabs advanced into the Maghreb, the more they faced determined opposition from Berber tribes and entrenched local leaders. The rugged geography, with its deserts, mountains, and scattered settlements, made rapid conquest difficult. The conquest of Carthage became a central objective, for the city symbolized Byzantine presence in Africa and served as a major hub of commerce and communication with the Mediterranean. Repeated attempts were made to take it. Uqba ibn Nafi, one of the most celebrated commanders of the early conquests, established the city of Kairouan around 670 as a base of operations. Situated inland, Kairouan was both a military garrison and a symbol of permanence. From there, Uqba launched expeditions deep into the Maghreb, at one point reportedly reaching the Atlantic coast, and exclaiming that he would continue onward if only the ocean did not stop him. His campaigns, though dramatic, were not definitive. Berber resistance and Byzantine counterattacks forced the Arabs to retreat at times, and Uqba himself was killed in battle against Berber forces. The cycle of advance and resistance continued for decades. Hassan ibn al-Nu'man, another key general, eventually succeeded in capturing Carthage in 698, after a protracted struggle. The fall of Carthage marked the end of significant Byzantine authority in North Africa, though pockets of resistance lingered. For the Berbers, the struggle was far from over. Figures such as the warrior Queen Dihya, known in Arabic sources as Al-Kahina, rallied tribes to resist Arab expansion. She led a powerful coalition in the late 7th century, defeating Arab forces in battle and retaking territory. Her resistance was fierce and prolonged, but eventually she was defeated and killed. her legacy remembered as a testament to Berber determination. Arab victories, however, were not only military, they brought with them the message of Islam, which carried a powerful appeal. Unlike previous conquerors who had imposed foreign political systems while largely ignoring indigenous culture, the Arabs introduced a universal faith that transcended tribal divisions and offered membership in a wider community, the Ummah. Conversion to Islam did not require abandoning Berber identity, but it provided a framework of religious law, spiritual meaning, and social cohesion that could unify diverse groups. Many Berbers adopted Islam, sometimes quickly, sometimes gradually, drawn by its egalitarian principles, the authority of the Quran, and the opportunities it provided within the expanding Islamic empire. Still, the process was not without tensions. Early Arab governors often treated Berbers as second-class Muslims, imposing taxes on them and restricting their roles within the army and administration. This inequity provoked revolts, most notably the Great Berber Revolt of the 740s, which spread across North Africa and into Spain, challenging the authority of the Umayyad Caliphate. The rebellion demonstrated that Islamization was not a simple or uniform process, but rather a negotiation in which Berbers demanded recognition of their equal status within the Muslim community. Over time, many of these tensions eased as Berbers were more fully integrated into Islamic society, but the memory of such struggles left an imprint on the development of Moorish identity. The establishment of Kairouan as a religious and cultural centre accelerated the process of Islamization. Mosques were built, scholars gathered, and Islamic law began to structure daily life. The city became one of the great centres of learning in the Western Islamic world, producing jurists, theologians, and administrators who would influence not only North Africa but also Al-Andalus. Through Kairouan, Islam spread into the hinterlands, reaching tribes in the mountains and deserts, often through a combination of religious teaching and practical benefits, such as access to trade networks and political alliances. Language played a crucial role in this transformation. Arabic gradually spread as the language of religion, administration, and high culture, while Berber languages remained vital in local contexts. This bilingualism created a layered identity, with Arabic serving as the unifying medium of Islamic civilization and Berber maintaining local traditions and oral heritage. Over time, many Berber dialects absorbed Arabic vocabulary, and Arab tribes migrating into the Maghreb further blurred the lines between the two. The synthesis that resulted was not a simple replacement of one identity by another, but a fusion that enriched both traditions. Trade routes flourished under Islamic rule, connecting the Maghreb more firmly to the broader Muslim world. Caravans moved across the Sahara, bringing gold, slaves, and ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, while Mediterranean ports facilitated exchanges with the Middle East and Europe. The Maghreb became a critical link in the global economy of the Islamic Golden Age, and Berbers were central actors in this network. Some tribes specialized in caravan trade, others in agriculture or crafts, and still others in military service for the Caliphate. Islam provided not only spiritual unity but also economic integration, positioning the Maghreb as both a frontier and a bridge between worlds. Culturally, the arrival of Islam reshaped artistic and intellectual life. Mosques, with distinctive North African features, began to rise, incorporating both Arab and Berber design elements. Calligraphy became a central art form, adorning manuscripts and architecture with Quranic verses. Islamic law, transmitted through schools of jurisprudence, established new norms for society. The Maliki school of law, in particular, took deep root in North Africa, shaping religious and legal practice for centuries. This legal framework, combined with local custom, created a uniquely Maghrebi expression of Islamic civilization. The Arab conquests and the Islamization of the Maghreb also had profound political consequences. The region became a launching point for further expansion into Iberia, as Berber soldiers, newly converted and integrated into Islamic armies, formed the backbone of the force that crossed into Spain in 711 under Tariq ibn Ziyad. Without the Islamization of the Berbers, the history of Al-Andalus would not have been possible. The conquest of the Maghreb was therefore not only a local transformation, but also a pivotal moment in the history of Europe and the Mediterranean. Yet even as Islam became the dominant faith, local traditions persisted. Berber social structures continued to shape daily life, and pre-Islamic customs were often incorporated into new religious practices. Saints' cults, for example, became an important part of North African Islam, blending indigenous traditions of reverence for holy figures with Islamic theology. Sufi brotherhoods would later flourish in the region, reflecting this deep synthesis of spirituality and local culture. By the early 8th century, the Maghreb was no longer a peripheral frontier. It had become an integral part of the Islamic world, contributing soldiers, scholars, and resources to the caliphate. The Arab conquests had brought Islam, but the Berbers had made it their own, reshaping it through their experiences and traditions. The result was a distinctive identity, both African and Islamic, that would soon project itself across the strait into Iberia. The Islamization of the Maghreb was not merely the adoption of a new religion, but the creation of a new civilization. It fused the endurance of Berber traditions with the universalism of Islam, the memory of Rome with the dynamism of the caliphate, the rugged independence of tribal life with the cohesion of religious law. This civilization, forged in the crucible of conquest and adaptation, was the foundation upon which the Moors of Spain would build their remarkable achievements. The stage was now set for the next act in this long history, the synthesis of Arab and Berber that gave rise to the community remembered as the Moors. When the Arab conquest of North Africa settled into a more permanent phase, what began to emerge was not simply the expansion of Islam into a new territory, but the birth of a new cultural identity that would carry enormous historical weight. This was the Moorish identity, a synthesis of Arab and Berber elements that fused language, faith, social structures, and political ambitions into something distinct from either of its parts. It was not an identity formed in a single moment or dictated from above, but rather a gradual construction shaped by centuries of interaction, adaptation, and negotiation. By the time armies prepared to cross into Iberia in the early 8th century, this synthesis had already begun to define a people who are both African and Islamic, both local and universal, both rooted in tribal traditions and aligned with the expansive vision of the caliphate. The Berbers, who had resisted and accommodated Carthage, Rome, and Byzantium, now found themselves grappling with the cultural pull of the Arab newcomers. Conversion to Islam provided them with new tools for political and spiritual organization, but it did not erase their tribal identities. Instead, Islam became a unifying framework within which Berber traditions could continue, now endowed with a broader religious legitimacy. Tribal structures adapted to fit into Islamic categories. Leaders took on Arabic titles, councils operated within the guidance of Islamic law, and warriors who once fought under local banners now declared their service to God and the caliphate. Yet at the same time, these Berber groups retained their own customs, languages, and regional loyalties, creating a dynamic where Islam was both transformative and accommodating. For Arabs, the Maghreb was not merely another conquered province, but a frontier that demanded integration with local populations. Unlike Syria or Egypt, where ancient urban traditions and administrative structures could be repurposed, the Maghreb required collaboration with Berber tribes who controlled vast hinterlands. Arab settlers and administrators married into Berber families, exchanged languages, and gradually blurred distinctions. Arabic became the language of the Quran, law, and administration. But Berber languages persisted in households, villages, and oral traditions. This bilingualism created a cultural depth that enriched both communities. Over generations, Arabic vocabulary seeped into Berber speech, while Berber placed names, oral histories, and customs influenced the identity of Arabist populations. The fusion was particularly visible in religion. While the Quran and Hadith provided the framework of Islamic belief, the lived practice of Islam in the Maghreb absorbed elements of Berber spirituality. Saints' shrines emerged, reflecting a blend of Islamic reverence for holy figures and older traditions of venerating ancestors or local spiritual leaders. These practices were not unique to North Africa. Saint veneration appeared throughout the Islamic world, but in the Maghreb they bore a distinct local flavour, binding Islam to the landscapes and histories familiar to Berber communities. This synthesis was not without conflict. Early Arab governors often attempted to assert superiority over Berber converts, demanding taxes or restricting their participation in leadership. The Great Berber Revolt of the 740s stands as the most dramatic expression of resentment against Arab dominance. Spanning North Africa and even parts of Iberia, the revolt drew on both tribal grievances and religious fervour. Many Berbers aligned with Kharijite movements, radical Islamic sects that emphasised equality among believers and rejected the privileges of Arab elites. The revolt shook Umayyad authority, forcing a reconsideration of policies and gradually leading to greater recognition of Berber contributions within the Islamic world. Out of this turbulent period emerged a more balanced synthesis. Berbers were no longer simply subjects of Arab rulers, they became partners in the Islamic project. Their soldiers formed the bulk of armies in the west, their leaders negotiated terms with caliphs and governors, and their scholars contributed to the spread of Islamic law and theology. The Maghreb was now unmistakably part of the Islamic world, yet it carried its own character, forged from the interplay of Arab and Berber traditions. Kairouan became the intellectual and spiritual capital of this synthesis. Founded as a military outpost, it grew into a centre of scholarship where Maliki jurisprudence took root. The Maliki school, emphasising tradition and community consensus, aligned well with the needs of the Maghreb, where diverse tribal groups required a flexible yet authoritative legal framework. Berber scholars studied in Kairouan, mastered Arabic, and carried Islamic teachings back to their tribes, embedding Islam more deeply into daily life. At the same time, the city absorbed influences from Berber culture, ensuring that religious practice in North Africa bore local nuances. The process of Arab-Berber synthesis was also economic. Trade networks flourished as Berbers, long experienced in controlling trans-Saharan routes, integrated into the broader Islamic economy. Gold from West Africa, salt from the Sahara, and slaves from sub-Saharan regions flowed north, while textiles, ceramics, and manufactured goods moved south. Berbers became indispensable intermediaries in this commerce, and their integration into the Islamic world expanded the reach of these networks. Arab merchants often relied on Berber guides, caravans, and local knowledge, further blending the two communities. Military service provided another avenue of synthesis. Berber cavalry, already famous in the ancient Mediterranean, became the backbone of Islamic armies in the west. They brought with them tactics suited to the harsh terrain, mobility across deserts and mountains, and resilience in battle. Arab commanders recognized their value, and over time many Berber leaders assumed significant military roles. When Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed into Iberia, the majority of his force was Berber, a testament to how central they had become to the Islamic project in the west. The conquest of Iberia was therefore not simply an Arab venture but a joint Arab-Berber enterprise, carried out by soldiers whose identity was already a synthesis of traditions. Socially, the intermarriage between Arabs and Berbers blurred distinctions further. Families carried mixed heritage, children grew up with both traditions, and over generations a shared identity emerged. This blending was not uniform. Some regions remained more strongly Berber, others more Arabized, but across the Maghreb the trend was toward fusion rather than separation. The term Moor, later used by Europeans, captured this fusion. Derived from Maori, the Roman term for the inhabitants of Mauritania, it was applied broadly to the Muslim populations of North Africa and Spain, regardless of whether they were Arab or Berber. The word itself testifies to the perception of a new identity that transcended older distinctions. This identity carried symbolic weight beyond the Maghreb. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the Moors represented a unified Islamic presence in Iberia, a formidable adversary whose culture, architecture, and learning soon became legendary. To the Islamic world, the Moors were a western frontier, pioneers who carried the faith into Europe and established one of the most vibrant civilizations of the Middle Ages. Yet within the Maghreb, Moorish identity remained layered, reflecting the ongoing interplay of Arab and Berber elements. Intellectual life reflected this synthesis. Berber scholars contributed to Islamic theology, jurisprudence, and philosophy, often writing in Arabic while infusing their works with perspectives shaped by their cultural heritage. Oral traditions preserved Berber history and folklore, while Arabic script became the medium through which these traditions were increasingly recorded. The fusion of oral and written culture created a distinctive intellectual landscape, one where local knowledge and universal Islamic scholarship coexisted. The birth of Moorish identity was not only about internal synthesis, but also about external projection. As Arab and Berber forces crossed into Iberia, they carried with them the cultural blend forged in the Maghreb. The architecture they built in Córdoba, Seville, and Granada bore the marks of both Arab design and Berber traditions. The governance they established reflected the tribal negotiations of the Maghreb, adapted to the Iberian context. The poetry, music, and philosophy that flourished in Al-Andalus were the flowering of seeds planted in North Africa, watered by the synthesis of Arab and Berber culture. This process was ongoing and never static. Moorish identity continued to evolve as new waves of migration, trade, and conflict reshaped the Maghreb and Iberia. But its foundation was laid in the centuries following the Arab conquest of North Africa, when Islam met Berber traditions and produced something new. It was not an erasure of the past, but a transformation, a layering of identities that created resilience, creativity, and adaptability. By the early 8th century, the synthesis was strong enough to support expansion into Europe, and the armies that crossed into Iberia carried more than weapons. They carried an identity forged in deserts and mountains, in tribal councils and mosques, in the interplay of Arabic scripture and Berber custom. That identity was Moorish, and it was about to leave its most enduring mark on history. By the beginning of the 8th century, the synthesis of Arab and Berber traditions in North Africa had produced not only a distinct identity, but also a formidable military and cultural force. The Maghreb was no longer a frontier clinging to the edges of empire. It had become a vibrant region of the Islamic world, where Berber tribes and Arab settlers had forged alliances, embraced a common faith, and organised under the banner of Islam. From this world emerged one of the most iconic figures in the history of the Moors, Tariq ibn Ziyad. His crossing of the strait that separated Africa from Europe in 711 marked not only a military campaign, but also the symbolic moment when Moorish civilization projected itself beyond its native lands and began to shape the destiny of Iberia. The circumstances leading to this crossing were as complex as the identity of those who undertook it. The Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus had extended its influence across vast territories from the Middle East through North Africa, but the Maghreb had never been a simple appendage of imperial power. Berber tribes, newly integrated into Islam, provided the manpower for armies, while Arab commanders supplied leadership and links to the caliphal authority. In this arrangement, cooperation was essential. The decision to send an expedition into Iberia was therefore not the whim of a single man, but the outcome of a political and military dynamic that had been building for decades. Iberia itself, known to the Romans as Hispania, had undergone centuries of transformation. After the fall of Rome, it became the kingdom of the Visigoths, a Germanic people who ruled over a population of Hispano-Romans with varying degrees of success. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom was racked by internal strife. Succession disputes and factional rivalries weakened central authority, creating opportunities for external intervention. It was into this fractured political landscape that the Moors entered, seizing a moment of vulnerability that would alter the course of European history. Tariq ibn Ziyad was the man chosen to lead the expedition. Accounts of his origins vary, reflecting the complexity of identity in the Maghreb. Many traditions describe him as a Berber, a detail that underscores the importance of Berber participation in the conquest of Iberia. Whether he was of noble lineage or rose through the ranks by military skill, his leadership exemplified the integration of Berbers into the Islamic military hierarchy. He served under Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of Ifriqiya appointed by the Umayyad Caliph, who oversaw the expansion of Islamic authority in North Africa and beyond. Musa recognized Tariq's abilities and entrusted him with command of the force that would cross into Iberia. The crossing itself became the stuff of legend. In April of 711, Tariq led an army estimated at around 7,000 men, the vast majority of them Berbers, across the narrow strait that separates Morocco from Spain. The passage was made possible by naval assistance, likely provided by ships from North Africa, or perhaps by local factions within Iberia itself, who saw in the Moors an opportunity to tip the balance of power in their own disputes. The landing took place at a rocky promontory that would forever bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, known today as Gibraltar. Legends surrounding Tariq's arrival speak to the symbolic weight of the event. One of the most famous stories recounts how, after landing, he ordered the ships that had carried his army to be burned, declaring that his men had no choice but to conquer or die. Historians debate the veracity of this tale, but its endurance reflects the drama of the moment. Whether or not he burned the ships, the act symbolized commitment and determination, qualities that defined the expedition. Tariq's army, cut off from retreat, faced the prospect of either triumph or annihilation, a circumstance that sharpened their resolve and bound them together in purpose. The first major challenge came in the form of the Visigothic army led by King Roderick. Sources describe Roderick as having been embroiled in internal conflicts before Tariq's arrival, which left his position weakened. Nevertheless, he rallied forces to confront the invaders. The two armies met near the Guadalete River in southern Spain. The battle that followed was decisive. Tariq's forces, though smaller in number, exploited divisions within the Visigothic ranks and used the mobility of their cavalry to devastating effect. The outcome was a crushing defeat for Roderick, who was either killed in the battle or disappeared, leaving the Visigothic kingdom leaderless and vulnerable. The victory at Guadalete opened the gates of Iberia to Tariq's army. Cities and towns began to fall, some after sieges, others through negotiation or surrender. The speed of the conquest surprised both contemporaries and later historians, but it was facilitated by the internal weaknesses of the Visigoths and the strategic acumen of the Moorish forces. Tariq pressed forward, capturing key centres such as Toledo, the Visigothic capital, and establishing Islamic authority across much of the peninsula. His success was so rapid that Musa ibn Nusayr himself eventually crossed into Iberia with reinforcements, both to support Tariq and to ensure that the conquest remained firmly under caliphal control. The partnership between Tariq and Musa was not without tension. Rivalries between commanders, questions of authority, and the distribution of spoils created friction, as they often did in medieval conquests. Yet their combined efforts ensured that within a few years, the majority of Iberia was under Islamic control. This achievement was not simply the result of military prowess, but of the synthesis carried across the strait. The soldiers who fought for Tariq were Berbers, newly integrated into Islam, infused with both tribal traditions and the universalist vision of the caliphate. Their identity as Moors was forged in the crucible of conquest, and their presence in Iberia marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of both Europe and the Islamic world. The conquest of Iberia under Tariq ibn Ziyad had far-reaching consequences. For the Islamic world, it represented the extension of Dar al-Islam into Europe, a frontier that would shape centuries of interaction between Muslim and Christian powers. For the Berbers, it offered opportunities for settlement, advancement, and prestige. Many who had once been marginalised within the Islamic community now found themselves landowners and governors in a new territory. For the Visigothic population, it meant adaptation to new rulers who imposed Islamic governance, but often allowed local customs and religions to persist under the system of dhimmi, or protected peoples. Culturally, the crossing of Gibraltar symbolised the transmission of North African traditions into Europe. Architecture, agricultural techniques, and intellectual currents that had developed in the Maghreb now took root in Iberia. The very name Gibraltar serves as a permanent reminder of this moment, a geographical marker of the fusion between Arab and Berber, Africa and Europe, Islam and local traditions. The figure of Tariq himself became legendary. Later chronicles, both Islamic and Christian, cast him in dramatic terms, sometimes as a heroic conqueror, sometimes as a fearsome invader. His Berber origins were emphasised in many accounts, highlighting the crucial role of Berbers in the conquest, and challenging narratives that framed the expansion as solely an Arab enterprise. Tariq embodied the synthesis of Arab-Berber identity, a general who commanded loyalty across tribal lines and projected Moorish power into a new continent. The rapid success of the conquest also raised questions within the Islamic world. The Caliph in Damascus demanded accountability from Musa and Tariq, summoning them to report on their achievements and ensure that the vast wealth and territories acquired were properly integrated into the caliphal system. This moment reveals the balance of autonomy and control that characterised the relationship between the Maghreb and the central Islamic authority. The Moors were not merely provincial subjects, they were actors shaping the destiny of the caliphate itself. The crossing of Gibraltar was therefore more than a military manoeuvre. It was a symbolic act that encapsulated the birth of Moorish identity and its projection beyond Africa. It represented the culmination of centuries of Berber resilience, Roman legacy, and Islamic transformation. It marked the beginning of Al-Andalus, the Moorish civilization in Spain that would become one of the most remarkable chapters of the Middle Ages, and it cemented Tariq ibn Ziyad's place in history as the man who carried the Moors across the threshold of Europe, leaving a legacy that endures in memory, in place names, and in the cultural fabric of two continents. The conquest of Iberia was only the beginning. The story of the Moors in Al-Andalus would unfold over centuries, with moments of brilliance and periods of decline, with achievements in science, philosophy and art, and with struggles against both internal fragmentation and external enemies. Yet all of it can be traced back to that crossing in 7111, when Tariq ibn Ziyad led his Berber soldiers across the strait, set foot on European soil, and forever altered the course of history. The entry of Tariq ibn Ziyad and his forces into Iberia marked the opening phase of a transformation, but the conquest of Hispania was not the achievement of a single battle or a single general. It was a process that unfolded over years, guided by both military momentum and political calculation, shaped by the interplay between Arab commanders, Berber soldiers, and the fractured world of the Visigothic kingdom. As the dust settled from the victory at Guadalete, the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus sought to consolidate the gains in Iberia, and to ensure that this new frontier was not simply the creation of ambitious local commanders, but a stable extension of the Islamic world. The conquest of Hispania by the Umayyads was thus both a continuation of Tariq's initial success and a deliberate project of imperial integration, one that would lay the foundation for centuries of Moorish presence in Al-Andalus. The Visigothic kingdom had long been vulnerable to such an incursion. Internally divided, weakened by disputes over succession, and lacking the cohesion of earlier Roman or Byzantine rule, it was ill-prepared to resist a determined external force. After the death or disappearance of King Roderick at Guadalete, the Visigoths found themselves without effective leadership. Factionalism among the nobility meant that cities and regions responded unevenly to the Moorish advance. Some fought valiantly, others negotiated terms of surrender, and still others sought to ally with the newcomers against local rivals. This fragmentation allowed the Moors to move with surprising speed, capturing territory not simply by force of arms, but by exploiting political divisions. Tariq's army pressed northward from the south, advancing through Andalusia into the heart of the peninsula. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, fell within months of Guadalete, a stunning development that symbolized the collapse of centralized resistance. Meanwhile, Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of Ifriqiya and Tariq's superior, crossed into Iberia in 712 with a larger force, estimated by some sources at 18,000 men. His arrival both reinforced the conquest and reasserted Arab authority over what might otherwise have been seen as a Berber-led enterprise. Musa's army included more Arab contingents, balancing the overwhelmingly Berber composition of Tariq's force and ensuring that the conquest reflected the combined efforts of the Islamic world in the West. The partnership between Musa and Tariq was complex. Both men were ambitious, both sought glory, and both represented different constituencies within the Maghreb. Tariq's Berber origins and his dramatic victories gave him popular acclaim, while Musa, as the governor, represented formal authority and the link to Damascus. Tensions between them arose, with disputes over command, spoils and recognition. Yet their combined campaigns extended the conquest deeper into Iberia. Together they subdued key cities such as Seville, Merida and Zaragoza, pushing Moorish control beyond the southern regions into the central and even northern parts of the peninsula. The conquest was not uniform or uncontested. Some regions, particularly in the mountainous north, resisted more stubbornly. The Cantabrian and Asturian highlands provided natural refuges for Visigothic resistance, and from these redoubts would eventually emerge the Christian kingdoms that launched the Reconquista. But in the early years, the scale of Moorish success was undeniable. By 716, just 5 years after Tariq's landing, the majority of the Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic control, a transformation of astonishing rapidity. The Umayyad conquest of Hispania was not merely military, it was also administrative. Once cities surrendered, the conquerors established systems of governance that integrated them into the Islamic world. This did not mean the wholesale replacement of existing structures. In many cases, the Moors allowed local elites to retain positions of authority under new oversight, provided they paid tribute and acknowledged Islamic supremacy. Christians and Jews, as people of the book, were granted the status of dhimmi, which allowed them to continue practicing their faiths in exchange for a special tax, the jizya. This arrangement was pragmatic, enabling the Moors to govern large populations without the impossible task of immediate conversion or assimilation. It also helped secure local cooperation, reducing resistance and fostering stability. Economically, the conquest opened Iberia to the vast networks of Islamic trade and commerce. Agricultural practices benefited from innovations brought from North Africa and the wider Muslim world, including new crops, irrigation techniques, and land management systems. Urban centres became integrated into Mediterranean markets, exchanging goods and ideas with North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. This economic integration not only enriched Al-Andalus, but also reinforced its place within the broader Umayyad Caliphate. Culturally, the conquest initiated a period of exchange that would eventually make Al-Andalus one of the most dynamic centres of medieval civilization. The Arabic language began to spread, initially among administrators and soldiers, later among local populations, especially in urban centres. Berber soldiers and settlers established communities, intermarried with local inhabitants, and introduced elements of their culture. The fusion of Arab, Berber and Hispano-Roman traditions laid the groundwork for the unique character of Moorish Spain. The role of the Umayyad Caliphate in this process was crucial. Though far away in Damascus, the Caliph exercised authority through Musa ibn Nusayr, who ensured that the conquest was not an independent venture, but part of the larger project of Islamic expansion. When reports of the rapid victories reached the Caliph, both Musa and Tariq were summoned to Damascus to account for their actions and deliver the spoils of conquest. This journey underscores the balance between local initiative and imperial control. While commanders in the west carried out campaigns with considerable autonomy, ultimate authority rested with the caliph. The wealth of Iberia, its fertile lands, and its strategic position were now seen as assets of the Umayyad state. Yet the conquest also revealed the tensions inherent in Arab-Berber relations. Berber soldiers, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, often felt marginalised in the distribution of land and rewards. Arab elites tended to claim the most fertile estates and positions of authority, relegating Berbers to less prestigious roles. These inequalities sowed seeds of resentment that would surface in later revolts. At the same time, the Berbers' overwhelming numerical presence in the armies meant that their cultural and social influence in Al-Andalus could not be ignored. Moorish identity in Iberia, as in North Africa, was the product of synthesis, and it was through the contributions of Berbers as much as Arabs that the new society took shape. The Umayyad conquest also carried symbolic weight for the Islamic world. It marked the first major expansion of Islam into Europe, beyond the Mediterranean basin that had been the focus of earlier campaigns. The crossing of the Pyrenees into Gaul, though ultimately unsuccessful, reflected the ambition of the conquerors to push even further. For the Caliphate, Hispania represented both a triumph and a challenge. A triumph because it extended the reach of Islam to new lands, a challenge because it required the integration of a diverse and distant territory into an empire already stretched across 3 continents. The legacy of the Umayyad conquest of Hispania was profound. It established the foundation for Al-Andalus, the Moorish state that would endure for centuries and produce extraordinary cultural achievements. It created a society where Muslims, Christians, and Jews interacted in ways that shaped philosophy, science, art, and literature. It redefined the political map of Europe, introducing a new power that Christian kingdoms would contend with for generations. And it reinforced the identity of the Moors as a people who were not merely North African but transcontinental, bridging Africa and Europe, Islam and Christendom. By the time Musa and Tariq returned to Damascus, their conquest was secure enough to endure, even as internal conflicts and external pressures continued to shape its development. The Umayyad Caliphate would soon face its own upheavals, with the Abbasid Revolution in 750 toppling the dynasty in the east. Yet in the west, the legacy of the Umayyad conquest of Hispania would survive, eventually giving rise to the independent Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba. What began as a military expedition had become the seed of a civilization, planted in the soil of Iberia by Berber and Arab hands, nurtured by the synthesis of traditions, and destined to bear fruit in centuries of cultural brilliance. The conquest of Hispania was not an end, but a beginning. The Moors who established themselves in Iberia did not see themselves as temporary occupiers, but as participants in a new chapter of the Islamic world. Their presence would shape the destiny of the peninsula for nearly 8 centuries, leaving legacies still visible in architecture, language, and memory. And though the Umayyads in Damascus would fall, their conquest in Hispania would endure, ensuring that the name of the Moors would forever be linked not only to Africa, but also to the heart of Europe. When the armies of Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr secured their victories across Iberia and brought the peninsula under the banner of Islam, what followed was not simply the extension of conquest, but the complex process of building a functioning society on foreign soil. This process gave birth to Al-Andalus, the name by which Islamic Spain became known, a state that was at once an extension of North Africa and the wider Umayyad Caliphate, yet also a distinct creation shaped by Iberian realities. The formation of Al-Andalus was a long unfolding rather than a single event, involving military consolidation, the settlement of populations, the creation of administrative structures, and the forging of a new cultural identity. From these foundations arose one of the most remarkable societies of the medieval world. The initial years after conquest were dominated by the practical needs of governance. The Muslim armies had moved swiftly across the peninsula, and the speed of their victories left many areas only lightly occupied. Garrison towns were established to secure strategic points, while agreements were made with local elites to ensure order. The dhimmi system, which granted Christians and Jews protection in exchange for tribute, provided a framework for managing the majority population, which remained non-Muslim. Local rulers who submitted were often allowed to retain authority under the oversight of Muslim governors, creating a patchwork of arrangements that balanced control with pragmatism. Administratively, Al-Andalus was integrated into the Umayyad Caliphate as a province, governed first from Kairouan and then more directly through officials appointed by Damascus. The governor, or wali, of Al-Andalus was responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and commanding military forces. Beneath him, local officials managed towns and districts, often working with existing Hispano-Roman institutions. Arabic was introduced as the language of administration, but Latin and local dialects continued to be used widely, reflecting the gradual nature of cultural transformation. The social fabric of early Al-Andalus was complex. At the top were the Arab elites, many of whom had come with Musa's army and claimed the most fertile lands and prestigious positions. Below them were the Berber soldiers and settlers, whose numerical strength had made the conquest possible, but who often found themselves marginalised in the distribution of rewards. Tensions between Arabs and Berbers flared repeatedly, leading to revolts and instability. Yet both groups were united by Islam and by the need to defend their new society against external threats. Over time, intermarriage, shared institutions and common interest helped to ease these divisions, though they never entirely disappeared. Beneath the Muslim ruling groups were the vast majority of the population, Christians, Jews, and converts to Islam. Many Christians continued to live much as before, practicing their faith in churches and monasteries, though subject to new taxes and restrictions. Jews, who had often faced persecution under Visigothic rule, found greater tolerance under Muslim governance, enjoying opportunities for economic and cultural flourishing. Converts, known as muwallads, occupied an ambiguous position, often seeking to rise within the Muslim community, but sometimes facing suspicion from both old Muslims and their former co-religionists. This diverse social order created both challenges and dynamism, as multiple traditions coexisted and interacted within the framework of Islamic governance. Economically, Al-Andalus quickly became integrated into the networks of the Islamic world. Agriculture expanded through the introduction of new crops and irrigation techniques from North Africa and the Middle East. Citrus fruits, rice, sugarcane, and cotton transformed the landscapes of Iberia, creating a more varied and productive agricultural base. The use of Qanat systems and advanced water management allowed for intensive cultivation, especially in the fertile valleys of Andalusia. Urban centres flourished as markets for these goods, linking the peninsula to trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. Cultural exchange was equally important in the formation of Al-Andalus. The Arabic language began to spread more widely, not only as the medium of administration, but also as the language of culture and learning. At the same time, Latin and local dialects persisted, creating a multilingual society. Over time, a Romance dialect known as Mozarabic emerged among Christians living under Muslim rule, blending Latin roots with Arabic vocabulary. This linguistic diversity reflected the broader cultural synthesis that characterized Al-Andalus. The early decades of Al-Andalus were also marked by political instability. Governors appointed from North Africa or Damascus often faced challenges from rival factions, Arab-Berber tensions, and local resistance. Revolts erupted periodically, requiring harsh suppression. The Great Berber Revolt of the 740s, which had swept across North Africa, also affected Al-Andalus, as Berber soldiers rose against Arab dominance and demanded greater recognition. Though eventually quelled, the revolt revealed the fragility of unity and the need for more stable structures of governance. It was in this context that the most dramatic political development occurred: the arrival of the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman Nahum in 756. Fleeing the Abbasid revolution that had overthrown the Umayyads in Damascus, Abd al-Rahman escaped to North Africa and eventually crossed into Iberia. There, he rallied supporters, defeated rivals, and established himself as the Emir of Córdoba. His rise transformed Al-Andalus from a distant province of a fallen dynasty into an independent state, ruled by a branch of the Umayyads in exile. Under Abd al-Rahman and his successors, Córdoba became the political and cultural heart of Al-Andalus, a city that symbolized both continuity with the Umayyad past and the creation of something new in the west. The formation of a distinct Moorish state in Al-Andalus was not just about political authority, but about cultural identity. The Moors, as they came to be known in European sources, were a people forged from Arab, Berber and Iberian elements, bound together by Islam yet enriched by the diversity of their society. Their architecture reflected this synthesis, blending Islamic forms with local traditions to create the unique style later known as Moorish. Their literature combined Arabic poetry with themes drawn from the landscapes and experiences of Iberia. Their sciences and philosophies drew on classical traditions preserved in the Islamic world, infused with original contributions that would later influence Europe. Religion remained central to this identity. Islam provided the unifying framework, but within Al-Andalus it developed unique expressions. The Maliki school of law dominated, shaping daily life and governance. Yet alongside strict legalism flourished mysticism, poetry, and philosophy, reflecting the dynamic interplay of faith and culture. Christians and Jews, though subordinate, contributed to the richness of this society, engaging in debates, translations, and artistic endeavours that crossed communal boundaries. The convivencia, or coexistence, of these groups was never without tension, but it created an environment of exchange that became one of the hallmarks of Al-Andalus. The geography of Iberia played its part in shaping the Moorish state. The fertile valleys of the south, the rugged mountains of the north, the strategic cities of the centre, all provided both opportunities and challenges. Defending such a diverse and expansive territory required constant vigilance, and the presence of Christian enclaves in the north ensured that conflict was never far away. Yet the same geography also fostered regional diversity within Al-Andalus, with distinct local identities contributing to the richness of the whole. Over time, Al-Andalus developed into more than just a province or a conquest. It became a civilization in its own right, rooted in the synthesis of traditions and the creativity of its people. From Córdoba to Granada, from Seville to Toledo, cities flourished as centres of learning, trade and culture. The Moorish state was not static but evolving, responding to internal challenges and external pressures while continually producing new forms of expression. The formation of Al-Andalus thus represents one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. What began as a military expedition became a society of extraordinary complexity, where Arab, Berber and Iberian elements blended into something new. The Moors of Al-Andalus carried with them the legacies of North Africa and the Islamic world, but they also created a civilization that was uniquely their own, one that would stand as a beacon of culture and learning for centuries to come. The foundations had been laid, but the true flowering of Al-Andalus was still to come. Córdoba would rise as the jewel of the West, a city of unparalleled brilliance that symbolized the heights of Moorish achievement. To understand how this transformation unfolded, one must look closely at the city that became the heart of Al-Andalus, the place where the synthesis of cultures reached its most dazzling expression. When Al-Andalus began to stabilize under the leadership of the Umayyads in exile, the city of Córdoba emerged as the heart of Moorish civilization. It was not inevitable that this would be so. In the early years after conquest, cities like Seville, Toledo and Zaragoza all held strategic or symbolic importance. Yet it was Córdoba, situated on the banks of the Guadalquivir River in the fertile region of Andalusia, that became the jewel of the Islamic West. Under the rule of Abd al-Rahman as-Sewai and his successors, Córdoba was transformed from a provincial town into one of the most dazzling cities of the medieval world, a place where power, learning and culture converged. The story of Córdoba is not simply that of a capital city, but of a symbol, a beacon of Moorish identity, and a testament to the synthesis of traditions that defined Al-Andalus. When Abd al-Rahman arrived in Iberia in 756, he inherited a land plagued by division. Arab and Berber factions competed for dominance, local leaders challenged authority, and the memories of the Visigothic past still lingered. By choosing Córdoba as his base, Abd al-Rahman was making a strategic decision. The city was centrally located in Andalusia, easily accessible by river and surrounded by fertile lands that could sustain its growth. More than geography, however, Córdoba offered the opportunity to create something new. Here, Abd al-Rahman could establish a capital that was distinct from Damascus, yet carried the grandeur of his Umayyad heritage. The transformation of Córdoba began with architecture. The construction of the Great Mosque, or Mesquita, became the centerpiece of Abd al-Rahman's vision. Built on the site of a former Visigothic church, the mosque symbolized both continuity and change, the layering of traditions into a new expression of faith. With its distinctive horseshoe arches, red and white voussoirs, and expansive hypostyle hall, the mosque embodied the fusion of Arab, Berber and Iberian influences. Over the centuries, successive rulers expanded and embellished it, turning it into one of the largest and most magnificent mosques in the Islamic world. For the people of Córdoba, the mosque was not only a place of worship, but also a gathering point, a school, and a symbol of the city's identity. But Córdoba was more than its mosque. Under Abd al-Rahman and his descendants, the city grew into a metropolis of remarkable scale. By the 10th century, during the reign of Abd al-Rahman III, Córdoba was said to rival Baghdad and Constantinople in size and splendour. Estimates suggest that it may have had 500,000 inhabitants, an extraordinary figure for the medieval world. Its streets were paved and lit with lamps, its markets bustled with activity, and its neighbourhoods teemed with life. Visitors marvelled at its aqueducts and baths, its gardens and palaces, its libraries and schools. For contemporaries, Córdoba represented the pinnacle of urban civilization in the West. The intellectual life of Córdoba was one of its greatest achievements. Scholars from across the Islamic world came to study and teach in the city, attracted by the patronage of rulers and the vibrancy of its intellectual climate. Libraries proliferated, containing hundreds of thousands of volumes. The colourful library alone was said to hold over 400,000 manuscripts, an almost unimaginable collection for the time. Copyists, translators and scholars worked tirelessly to preserve, expand and transmit knowledge. Greek texts on philosophy and science were translated into Arabic, often via Syriac intermediaries, ensuring their survival and preparing the way for their later transmission to Europe. Works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine and geography flourished, blending classical traditions with original contributions from Muslim scholars. Córdoba's intellectual brilliance was not confined to abstract studies. Practical sciences thrived as well. Physicians trained in Córdoba advanced medical knowledge, building on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, while introducing new observations and treatments. Astronomers mapped the heavens, refining calculations that would later guide navigation and exploration. Mathematicians developed algebraic methods and refined numerical systems, including the use of Arabic numerals that would eventually revolutionize European mathematics. These achievements were not the work of Arabs alone or Berbers alone, but the product of a society that valued learning across boundaries, drawing contributions from Muslims, Christians and Jews alike. The convivencia of Córdoba, while not free of tension, created an environment where diverse traditions interacted. Jewish scholars such as Hasdai ibn Shaprut served in positions of prominence at the Umayyad court, facilitating diplomacy and contributing to intellectual life. Christian communities, though subject to restrictions, maintained their traditions and participated in cultural exchange. Mozarabs, Christians who adopted aspects of Arabic culture, became intermediaries between worlds, blending Latin and Arabic influences in their language, art and literature. The result was a society that, while hierarchically structured, allowed for a degree of interaction rare in the medieval world. Córdoba's economic prosperity underpinned its cultural achievements. The fertile lands of Andalusia, enriched by irrigation and new crops, produced surpluses that sustained urban growth. Trade routes connected the city to North Africa, the Middle East, and even as far as India and China. Markets overflowed with goods, silk and spices, gold and ivory, ceramics and glassware. Artisans produced textiles of remarkable beauty, while craftsmen created intricate metalwork, woodwork, and ceramics. The wealth of Córdoba not only enriched its rulers, but also provided the means to patronize scholars, artists, and architects, ensuring that the city's brilliance was sustained. Politically, Córdoba represented the strength and stability of the Umayyad Emirate, later elevated to the status of caliphate under Abd al-Rahman III in 929. By declaring himself caliph, Abd al-Rahman asserted independence from both the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in North Africa, positioning Córdoba as the centre of a rival caliphate in the west. This declaration was more than a political manoeuvre. It was a statement of confidence in the city's stature, a recognition that Córdoba had become a power equal to the greatest capitals of the Islamic world. The Caliphate of Córdoba endured for over a century, presiding over a golden age of stability and cultural flourishing. Yet the splendour of Córdoba was not immune to the fragility of political structures. Internal rivalries, factionalism, and the challenges of governing a diverse population eventually undermined unity. By the early 11th century, the Caliphate fractured into a series of smaller kingdoms, the taifas, each vying for power. Córdoba itself declined, its greatness remembered in nostalgia even as political power shifted elsewhere. But even in decline, the memory of Córdoba as the jewel of the Islamic West endured, inspiring poets, chroniclers, and later historians. The legacy of Córdoba was not only in its monuments and manuscripts, but in the transmission of knowledge to Europe. Through translations into Latin, often carried out in later centuries in places like Toledo, the intellectual heritage of Córdoba passed into the hands of European scholars, fueling the Renaissance. The works preserved and expanded in Córdoba on medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy became the foundation upon which European science and thought were rebuilt. In this way, the city's influence extended far beyond its own time, shaping the course of world history. Córdoba thus stands as a symbol of what Al-Andalus represented at its height, a society of synthesis, creativity, and brilliance, rooted in the fusion of Arab, Berber, and Iberian traditions, sustained by prosperity, and animated by the pursuit of knowledge. It was not without its flaws. Inequality, conflict, and eventual decline were all part of its story. But in its golden age it shone with a brilliance that few cities in history have matched. For the Moors, Córdoba was both a capital and a symbol, a testament to what their civilization could achieve, and a reminder of the identity they had forged on European soil. From the heights of Córdoba's splendour, the story of the Moors unfolds further into the realms of philosophy, science, and cultural transmission. The city was not an endpoint, but a foundation, the base from which Moorish civilization radiated its influence across Europe and the Islamic world alike. To understand the full significance of the Moors, one must trace how the brilliance of Córdoba fed into the broader currents of knowledge, shaping disciplines that would define entire eras of human history. From the splendour of Córdoba, the story of the Moors moves naturally into the realm of intellectual achievement, for it was in the fields of science, philosophy, and the preservation and transmission of knowledge that Al-Andalus left one of its most enduring legacies. The brilliance of Córdoba and other Moorish centres was not merely architectural or political, it was intellectual. In a time when much of Europe experienced fragmentation and decline in organised learning, the Moors cultivated scholarship, gathered manuscripts, debated philosophical questions, and advanced scientific disciplines with a rigour and passion that would echo far beyond their own borders. The flowering of knowledge in Al-Andalus was part of a broader Islamic golden age, yet it bore its own distinctive character, shaped by the synthesis of Arab, Berber and Iberian traditions. The roots of this intellectual culture lay in the Islamic commitment to knowledge. The Quran itself exhorted believers to reflect on creation, to seek understanding, and to value learning. The early caliphs of the Islamic world had established institutions such as the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where Greek, Persian and Indian texts were translated into Arabic and preserved. Al-Andalus, though geographically distant, was firmly connected to this movement. Scholars in Córdoba, Toledo, Seville and Granada drew upon the resources of the wider Islamic world, while also cultivating local traditions of inquiry. One of the most remarkable aspects of Moorish intellectual life was the preservation of classical knowledge. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, much of its philosophical and scientific heritage was lost or forgotten in Europe. In Al-Andalus, however, these traditions were not only preserved but actively studied and expanded. Texts of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy and others, often translated into Arabic from Greek via Syriac, became the foundation for philosophical and scientific inquiry. The Moors were not content simply to copy these works. They commented on them, debated their implications, and integrated them into Islamic frameworks of thought. In doing so, they ensured that the wisdom of antiquity was not extinguished but reborn in new forms. Philosophy was one of the fields where this synthesis was most evident. Thinkers such as Ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes, embodied the intellectual vigour of Al-Andalus. A native of Córdoba in the 12th century, Ibn Rushd devoted himself to the study of Aristotle, producing commentaries that would later have a profound influence on European scholasticism. His insistence on rational inquiry, his exploration of the relationship between reason and revelation, and his defence of philosophy as a legitimate pursuit within Islam made him both celebrated and controversial. While some traditionalists in his own society resisted his rationalism, in Europe his works were translated into Latin and became central to the intellectual revival of the 13th century, shaping the thought of figures such as Thomas Aquinas. Another towering figure was Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. Though he lived in Persia rather than Al-Andalus, his works reached Moorish Spain and were studied avidly. His medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, became a standard reference for centuries, not only in the Islamic world but in medieval Europe as well. In Al-Andalus, physicians such as Al-Zarawi, known as a Bulcasis, advanced medical practice to extraordinary levels. Living in Córdoba in the 10th and early 11th centuries, Al-Zahrawi wrote a medical encyclopedia, the Kitab al-Tasrif, that covered surgery, pharmacology, and a wide range of medical treatments. His detailed descriptions of surgical instruments and techniques were so advanced that his work remained a reference in Europe well into the Renaissance. Astronomy was another field where Moorish scholars excelled. Building on the works of Ptolemy, they refined models of planetary motion, developed new instruments such as the astrolabe, and created observatories to study the heavens. These efforts were not purely theoretical. Astronomy was closely tied to practical needs, determining the direction of Mecca for prayer, calculating the Islamic calendar, and aiding navigation across seas and deserts. In Al-Andalus, scholars such as Maslama al-Majriti contributed to astronomical studies, while also engaging with mathematics and alchemy. Their work linked practical concerns with profound philosophical questions about the nature of the cosmos. Mathematics flourished alongside these pursuits. The adoption of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero, revolutionized calculation, making complex mathematical operations far easier than under the cumbersome Roman numerals still used in much of Europe. Algebra, a term derived from the Arabic word al-jaba, was developed further by Moorish scholars, who applied it to problems in commerce, inheritance, and architecture. Geometry, essential for both astronomy and building, was studied with precision, and trigonometry advanced in ways that would later influence European navigation and exploration. Geography and cartography were also significant. The Moors inherited the geographical works of Ptolemy, but went beyond them, integrating knowledge gained from travel, trade, and exploration. Scholars such as Al-Idrisi, though based in Sicily, drew heavily on the knowledge networks of Al-Andalus to produce some of the most sophisticated maps of the medieval world. These maps depicted not only the Mediterranean but also Africa, Asia, and parts of northern Europe, reflecting the global horizons of the Islamic world. For the Moors, geography was not only a scholarly pursuit but a practical necessity, given their role as intermediaries in trade routes that spanned continents. The transmission of knowledge was as important as its production. In Al-Andalus, translation movements played a crucial role in bridging cultures. Texts originally in Greek, translated into Arabic, were studied and elaborated upon by Muslim scholars. Later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, many of these works were translated from Arabic into Latin in centres such as Toledo. This transmission was one of the key channels through which the intellectual heritage of antiquity, preserved and enhanced by the Moors, entered medieval Europe. Without it, the Renaissance would have lacked much of its foundation. The works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and countless others reached European scholars not directly from the Greeks, but through the intermediary of Moorish Spain. The transmission was not limited to texts. It included techniques, instruments, and practices. Surgical instruments described by Al-Zahrawi, astronomical devices such as the astrolabe, mathematical methods developed in Al-Andalus, all found their way into European use. Even agricultural innovations such as irrigation methods and new crops represented a form of practical knowledge transmission that reshaped European societies. The Moors, through their openness to learning and their role as cultural intermediaries, became conduits through which knowledge flowed across boundaries. This intellectual culture was sustained by institutions. Mosques often served as schools, where children learned to read the Quran and acquire basic literacy. More advanced studies took place in madrasas, where students engaged with theology, law, philosophy, and science. Libraries, both private and public, provided resources for scholars. The patronage of rulers, eager to enhance the prestige of their courts, ensured that scholars were supported, manuscripts were copied, and debates were encouraged. The result was a vibrant intellectual climate that made Al-Andalus one of the most learned societies of its age. The coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus added another layer to this intellectual dynamism. Jewish scholars such as Maimonides, who was born in Córdoba in the 12th century, engaged deeply with both Islamic philosophy and Jewish tradition, producing works that would influence both traditions. Christian translators and scholars participated in the movement of knowledge, sometimes serving as intermediaries between Arabic and Latin. This cross-pollination enriched all communities, creating a shared intellectual heritage even amid religious divisions. The achievements of the Moors in science and philosophy were not isolated curiosities, but part of a continuum that linked antiquity to the Renaissance. They preserved what might otherwise have been lost, expanded upon it with original contributions, and transmitted it across cultural boundaries. In doing so, they shaped the intellectual history of Europe, and by extension, the world. The brilliance of Al-Andalus was therefore not only in its monuments of stone, but in the monuments of thought, the ideas and discoveries that transcended time and space. From philosophy to medicine, from mathematics to astronomy, from geography to translation, the Moors of Al-Andalus played a central role in the history of human knowledge. Their achievements remind us that civilizations are not isolated but interconnected, that progress is often the result of synthesis, and that the pursuit of knowledge can bridge even the widest divides. As Córdoba shone with the light of learning, its influence radiated outward, reaching lands and centuries far beyond its own. The legacy of this intellectual flowering cannot be overstated. It was the foundation upon which later generations built, the bridge between antiquity and modernity, the gift of the Moors to a world that often forgot to acknowledge its debt. Yet alongside science and philosophy, another realm of Moorish achievement deserves attention, for their art and architecture expressed in stone and colour what their scholars expressed in words and numbers. The aesthetic achievements of the Moors, no less than their intellectual ones, would shape the character of Al-Andalus and leave traces that endure to this day. The intellectual brilliance of Al-Andalus found its parallel in the physical and artistic world that the Moors created. If their scholars preserved and expanded the wisdom of antiquity, their architects, artisans, and poets gave form to beauty in stone, tile, fabric, and verse. The Andalusian aesthetic, as it came to be known, was not the product of one culture alone, but the expression of the synthesis that defined Moorish identity. In palaces, mosques, gardens, and even in the layout of cities, the Moors articulated a vision of harmony that blended Arab, Berber, and Iberian traditions, with influences drawn from across the Islamic world. To walk through the surviving monuments of Al-Andalus is to experience the embodiment of a civilization that sought not only to conquer and govern, but also to adorn and elevate. The Great Mosque of Córdoba stands as the most famous symbol of Moorish architecture. Begun under Abd al-Rahman Khurram in the late 8th century and expanded by his successors, it represents the layering of centuries of artistic vision. Its forest of columns, supporting arches of alternating red and white stone, creates an impression of endless space, a metaphor for the infinity of the divine. The horseshoe arch, an element with roots in Visigothic and Berber traditions, was perfected and multiplied here, becoming a hallmark of Moorish design. Later additions, such as the richly decorated mihrab with its intricate mosaics, demonstrate the ability of Andalusian artisans to integrate Byzantine influences into an Islamic framework. The mosque was not only a place of prayer, but also a cultural centre, embodying the fusion of traditions that defined Al-Andalus. Beyond Córdoba, other cities developed their own monuments. In Seville, the construction of the Almohad minaret, later known as the Giralda, displayed the elegance of Islamic design while influencing the skyline of the city for centuries to come. In Granada, the Alhambra would rise as the supreme expression of Moorish art and architecture, a palace complex of breathtaking beauty where geometry, calligraphy, and natural elements combined to create an otherworldly harmony. Though constructed in the later period of Al-Andalus, the Alhambra reflects the culmination of centuries of aesthetic development, embodying the ideals that had been nurtured in earlier generations. One of the defining features of Moorish architecture was its emphasis on space and light. Courtyards, fountains, and gardens were integral parts of buildings, creating environments where nature and architecture intertwined. Water, a precious resource in the Iberian climate, was used not only for practical purposes, but also for aesthetic effect, reflecting sunlight, producing soothing sounds, and symbolizing purity. The garden became a microcosm of paradise, an earthly reflection of heavenly order. This integration of nature into architecture expressed a world-view in which beauty, utility, and spirituality were inseparable. Decoration played a central role in the Andalusian aesthetic. Islamic art, avoiding figurative representation in religious contexts, turned instead to geometry, calligraphy, and vegetal motifs. Moorish artisans mastered the use of intricate patterns that repeated infinitely, suggesting the boundless nature of the divine. Calligraphy adorned walls and ceilings, inscribing Quranic verses and poetic lines that transformed architecture into a medium of text. The arabesque, with its flowing vegetal forms, conveyed both movement and stillness, life and order. Tiles, or azulejos, displayed brilliant colours and complex designs, covering surfaces with a vibrancy that dazzled the eye. In every element, the goal was not mere ornament, but the creation of an environment that reflected harmony and elevated the spirit. The aesthetic of Al-Andalus was not confined to monumental architecture. Everyday objects bore the same attention to beauty. Ceramics produced in Moorish workshops were prized for their craftsmanship and design, influencing styles across the Mediterranean. Textiles, woven with intricate patterns and rich colours, adorned homes and markets. Metalwork, wood carving, and ivory sculpture demonstrated the versatility of artisans who could create both functional objects and works of art. Even coins bore artistic value, inscribed with elegant Arabic script that communicated authority while embodying beauty. Poetry was another realm where the Andalusian aesthetic flourished. The Moors inherited the rich tradition of Arabic poetry, with its emphasis on rhythm, metaphor, and eloquence, and adapted it to the landscapes and experiences of Iberia. Themes of love, nature, and philosophy infused their verses, reflecting both personal emotions and universal truths. Courts in Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became centres of poetic production, where rulers and nobles patronised poets whose works celebrated beauty and wisdom. The muwashshah, a poetic form that emerged in Al-Andalus, exemplifies this creativity, blending Arabic and Romance elements into a structure that later influenced European lyric poetry. Music, too, carried the Andalusian aesthetic. Instruments such as the oud, the kanun, and percussion instruments were used in ensembles that developed sophisticated musical forms. Ziryab, a musician who arrived in Córdoba from Baghdad in the 9th century, revolutionized Andalusian music, introducing new modes, instruments, and fashions. His influence extended beyond music to cuisine, etiquette, and culture, making him one of the most remarkable cultural figures of his time. The musical traditions of Al-Andalus, blending Arab, Berber, and local elements, survived long after the fall of Moorish Spain, influencing North African and Mediterranean music for centuries. The Andalusian aesthetic was also evident in urban design. Cities of Al-Andalus were not chaotic sprawls but organised environments that reflected both practical needs and artistic vision. Narrow winding streets provided shade and defence, while open squares allowed for markets and gatherings. Baths, mosques, palaces and markets created focal points of community life. The balance between private and public space, between order and variety, reflected the Moorish commitment to harmony. Urban centres became reflections of the civilization's values, embodying both functionality and beauty. Underlying this aesthetic was a philosophy of balance. The Moors sought to harmonise opposites, light and shadow, geometry and fluidity, utility and ornament, tradition and innovation. This philosophy was not abstract but embodied in physical forms, shaping the environments in which people lived, worked, and prayed. It was a philosophy that recognised beauty as integral to life, not a luxury but a necessity for the cultivation of spirit and society. The influence of the Andalusian aesthetic extended far beyond Al-Andalus itself. Through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, Moorish art and architecture left their mark on Christian Europe. The horseshoe arch, for example, was adopted in Romanesque architecture. The use of intricate tilework spread into Mediterranean decorative traditions. Even after the Reconquista, Spanish architecture retained Moorish elements, visible in the Mudejar style that blended Islamic motifs with Christian structures. The aesthetic of Al-Andalus thus became part of the broader heritage of Europe, testifying to the enduring impact of Moorish creativity. The survival of this aesthetic in memory and monuments speaks to its power. The Alhambra, the Giralda, the Mesquita, and countless other works continue to inspire awe, reminding us of a civilization that valued beauty alongside knowledge, harmony alongside power. The Andalusian aesthetic was not mere decoration, but an expression of a worldview that saw the divine in pattern, the infinite in geometry, the eternal in calligraphy, and paradise in the garden. It was the physical manifestation of the synthesis that defined the Moors, a synthesis that blended traditions into something new and unforgettable. From the brilliance of art and architecture, the story of the Moors turns again to their role in the wider medieval world. They were not only builders and poets, but also traders, diplomats, and intermediaries, connecting Europe with Africa and the Islamic East. Their aesthetic achievements were mirrored by their economic and political roles, ensuring that Al-Andalus was not an isolated jewel, but part of a larger web of medieval exchange and interaction. The civilization of Al-Andalus was not built on ideas and aesthetics alone. Its strength and brilliance were also grounded in material prosperity, in the flows of goods, wealth, and people that tied it to the broader medieval world. The Moors were not only warriors and scholars, they were merchants, farmers, artisans, and intermediaries, linking regions through networks of exchange that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The role of the Moors in European medieval trade was profound, shaping economies and societies on both sides of the Mediterranean. To understand the full impact of Moorish civilization, one must trace these networks of commerce and see how the Moors stood at their centre. Geography gave Al-Andalus a privileged position in trade. Situated at the western edge of the Mediterranean, with access to the Atlantic Ocean, fertile river valleys and mountain passes, the peninsula was a crossroads of routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Islamic East. The Guadalquivir River carried goods from inland Córdoba to the sea, while ports like Almeria, Malaga, and Valencia linked Iberia to North Africa and beyond. The Strait of Gibraltar, controlled by the Moors, became one of the most important maritime choke points of the medieval world, through which passed the ships that connected the western Mediterranean with the Atlantic and northern Europe. Within Iberia, the Moors transformed agriculture and production to create surpluses that sustained trade. They introduced new crops such as rice, sugarcane, citrus fruits, cotton, and pomegranates, adapting them to the Iberian climate through advanced irrigation systems. These innovations, known as the agricultural revolution of Al-Andalus, increased productivity and diversified the economy. Olive oil, wine, grains and livestock continued to be staples, but the addition of exotic crops gave Andalusian markets a distinctive richness. Surpluses from rural estates flowed into urban centres, where artisans transformed raw materials into finished products. Textiles, ceramics, leather goods, and metalwork from Moorish cities became prized commodities across the Mediterranean. The markets of Al-Andalus, known as souks, were vibrant spaces where goods from across the known world were exchanged. Spices from the East, gold from Africa, furs from northern Europe, and local products all mingled in stalls and warehouses. Merchants from diverse backgrounds, Muslims, Jews and Christians, traded side by side, using Arabic as the lingua franca of commerce. Contracts, bills of exchange and credit systems facilitated transactions, reflecting the sophistication of Moorish commercial practices. These markets were not only economic hubs, but also cultural crossroads, where languages, ideas, and fashions were exchanged alongside goods. The Moors played a vital role as intermediaries between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. Through their control of trans-Saharan trade routes, they connected the gold mines of West Africa with Mediterranean markets. Caravans carried gold, ivory and slaves northward, while salt, textiles, and manufactured goods moved south. Cities like Sijil Massa in Morocco became key nodes in this trade, linked to Al-Andalus by maritime and overland routes. The influx of West African gold in particular fueled the economies of both the Islamic world and Christian Europe, enabling the circulation of coinage and the financing of states. Without Moorish mediation, these resources would not have reached Europe in the quantities they did. North Africa formed another crucial link in this network. The ports of Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia connected Al-Andalus to the wider Islamic world. Ships crossed the narrow strait regularly, carrying not only goods but also people, scholars, officials, soldiers, and pilgrims. The relationship between Al-Andalus and the Maghreb was symbiotic. North Africa supplied resources and manpower, while Al-Andalus provided markets and cultural prestige. This constant exchange ensured that the two shores of the Western Mediterranean developed in tandem, bound together by commerce as much as by faith and politics. The Mediterranean trade of the Moors extended eastward as well. Through connections with Egypt and the Levant, goods from India and China reached Al-Andalus. Silk, spices, paper, and porcelain travelled along these routes, passing through Cairo, Tunis, and Almeria, before reaching Córdoba or Seville. The Moors thus became part of the global trade system of the medieval world, bringing the riches of Asia to the markets of Europe. At the same time, Andalusian products, especially textiles and ceramics, found their way eastward, demonstrating that trade was not a one-way flow, but a reciprocal exchange. Relations with Christian Europe were complex, but economically fruitful. Even amid conflict, trade persisted across the frontier. Christian merchants came to Moorish ports to purchase goods unavailable in their own lands, while Moorish merchants traded in Christian markets. The exchange of products such as olive oil, wine, timber, and iron enriched both sides. Christian states in northern Spain relied on trade with the Moors to obtain luxury goods, while Moorish cities imported raw materials from the north. Over time, Italian merchants from cities like Genoa, Pisa, and Venice established connections with Al-Andalus, further integrating it into European trade networks. Jewish merchants, often operating under Moorish protection, played a particularly important role in these exchanges. Their ability to navigate between Muslim and Christian societies, their knowledge of languages, and their extensive networks made them indispensable intermediaries. Figures like the Radhanites, Jewish merchants who traded across Eurasia, linked Al-Andalus with markets as far afield as India and China. Their activities highlight the cosmopolitan nature of Moorish trade, where religious and cultural diversity was not a barrier, but an asset. The prosperity generated by trade underpinned the cultural achievements of Al-Andalus. The wealth of merchants and rulers funded the construction of mosques, palaces, and libraries. It supported scholars, poets, and artists, allowing them to pursue their work in an environment of relative security. The circulation of goods brought with it the circulation of ideas, scientific instruments from the East, philosophical texts from Greece, artistic techniques from Byzantium. Trade was not only economic but also intellectual and cultural, fueling the dynamism that made Al-Andalus a beacon of medieval civilization. The role of the Moors in European medieval trade extended beyond their own borders. Their agricultural innovations spread into Christian Europe, transforming rural economies. Their techniques of irrigation and crop rotation were adopted in Sicily, southern Italy, and eventually further north. Their commercial practices, such as the use of bills of exchange, influenced the development of European banking. Even their urban markets served as models for the growth of European towns. In these ways, the economic contributions of the Moors shaped the trajectory of Europe's medieval development. The control of trade also had political implications. The wealth of Al-Andalus allowed rulers to maintain armies, negotiate alliances, and assert independence. The Umayyad caliphs of Córdoba, for example, used their economic strength to rival the Abbasids and Fatimids, projecting power across the Mediterranean. Even during periods of political fragmentation, such as the era of the Taifa kingdoms, trade continued to sustain Moorish states, enabling them to survive despite military pressures. The flow of goods was thus a lifeline that kept Moorish civilization vibrant even in times of crisis. Yet the very wealth of Al-Andalus also attracted external pressures. Christian kingdoms in the north sought to capture the fertile lands and prosperous cities of the south. Later, European merchants and crusaders viewed Moorish ports as both competitors and prizes. The history of the Reconquista cannot be understood without recognizing the economic motives that accompanied religious and political ones. The riches of Andalusian trade made it both admired and envied, a target as much as a model. The role of the Moors in trade was therefore multifaceted. They were producers, innovators, and intermediaries, linking continents and cultures. They sustained their own civilization through prosperity, but they also shaped the wider medieval world through their contributions. Their markets and caravans, ships and workshops were as significant as their scholars and architects in defining the legacy of Al-Andalus. The story of the Moors cannot be separated from the story of medieval trade, for commerce was both the foundation and the expression of their civilization. From the wealth of trade, the narrative of the Moors moves back into the realm of politics and culture. The prosperity that fueled Córdoba and enriched Al-Andalus did not prevent internal divisions. The Great Caliphate would eventually fragment, giving rise to the Taifa kingdoms, small states that reflected both the creativity and the vulnerability of Moorish Spain. To understand how the brilliance of Al-Andalus endured amid political disunity, one must follow the story into this era of fragmentation, where the legacy of Córdoba gave way to a mosaic of states, each carrying forward aspects of the Moorish tradition. The brilliance of Córdoba as the capital of Al-Andalus did not last forever. At its height under Abd al-Rahman III and his successors, the Caliphate of Córdoba projected stability, prosperity and cultural achievement unmatched in the medieval West. But political structures, no matter how grand, rest on fragile foundations. Rivalries within the ruling family, the pressures of managing a diverse and often divided society, and the constant strain of defending long borders against both Christian kingdoms to the north and competing Islamic dynasties to the south eventually overwhelmed the unity of the state. By the early 11th century, the Caliphate fractured, leaving in its place a patchwork of smaller states known as the Taifa kingdoms. The word Taifa comes from the Arabic taifa, meaning faction or group, a term that captures the essence of this period. Where once there had been a single centralized authority, there were now dozens of local rulers, each commanding a city and its surrounding territory. Seville, Toledo, Zaragoza, Valencia, Granada, Badajoz, and many others became the centres of these new polities. Some taifas were ruled by descendants of the Umayyads, others by ambitious generals, and still others by Berber leaders who had risen through military ranks. The fragmentation reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of Moorish civilization, its capacity for local creativity and resilience, and its vulnerability to division and external pressure. The fall of the Caliphate was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unravelling. Factional struggles within Córdoba weakened the authority of the Caliph. Military leaders, known as Sakaliba, often slaves of Slavic origin who had risen to prominence, carved out independent power bases. Berber troops, long resented for their treatment under Arab elites, asserted autonomy in various regions. As Córdoba descended into civil war, known as the Fitna, its ability to project power across Al-Andalus dissolved. By 1031, the Caliphate was formally abolished, and the era of the Taifas began. Each Taifa kingdom was a reflection of its city, and each developed its own character. Seville emerged as one of the strongest, ruled by the Abbadid dynasty, who combined military strength with cultural patronage. Toledo, strategically located in the centre of the peninsula, maintained significance as both a political and intellectual hub. Zaragoza flourished under the Banuhid dynasty, cultivating scholarship and art even as it defended itself against Christian advances. Granada, Valencia, and others likewise developed distinctive identities. In this way, the fragmentation of Al-Andalus did not mean the end of Moorish civilization, but rather its diversification into multiple centres. The Taifas, though smaller, often rivaled or even surpassed Córdoba in cultural brilliance. Competition among rulers spurred patronage of poets, scholars and architects. Courts vied with one another to display refinement, sponsoring works of literature and constructing splendid palaces. Poets such as Ibn Hazm of Córdoba, who lived during this period, wrote on love, philosophy and theology, producing works that remain celebrated today. Music and the arts flourished as rulers sought to legitimize their authority through displays of sophistication. The Taifa courts thus became crucibles of creativity, continuing the Andalusian aesthetic in new forms. Economically, the taifas sustained themselves through agriculture, trade and tribute. Many maintained the irrigation systems and agricultural innovations inherited from the Caliphate, ensuring productive lands. Their markets remained vibrant, connected to Mediterranean trade routes and the networks of North Africa. Yet the political fragmentation weakened their ability to defend against external threats. Christian kingdoms in the north, particularly Castile, Leon, Navarre and Aragon, grew stronger during this period, taking advantage of the divisions among the Moors. The system of parias, or tribute payments, became a defining feature of the era. Taifa rulers, unable to resist militarily, often paid tribute to Christian monarchs in exchange for peace. These payments enriched the Christian kingdoms, financing their own growth and expansion, while draining the resources of the taifas. The system of parias illustrates the precarious balance of power. On the one hand, it allowed the taifas to survive, buying time and maintaining autonomy in the face of superior military pressure. On the other hand, it exposed their vulnerability and contributed to the strengthening of their adversaries. The Christian kingdoms used this wealth to fund castles, armies, and campaigns that would gradually push the frontier southward. The fragmentation of Al-Andalus thus directly facilitated the progress of the Reconquista. Despite their political weakness, the taifas continued to attract admiration for their cultural achievements. Christian rulers, even as they demanded tribute, were often fascinated by the sophistication of Moorish courts. Diplomats and envoys travelled between Christian and Muslim cities, exchanging gifts, knowledge, and even artists. The intellectual wealth of the taifas influenced Christian Europe as translations of Arabic texts into Latin began to accelerate, particularly in Toledo after its eventual conquest. The paradox of the period was that while the Moors lost political ground, they continued to exert immense cultural influence. The role of the Berbers during the Taifa period is particularly notable. Many of the new rulers were of Berber origin, reflecting the long-standing presence and importance of Berber soldiers in Al-Andalus. In Granada, for example, the Zirid dynasty, descended from Berbers in North Africa, established a kingdom that would endure for nearly a century. These rulers brought with them traditions from the Maghreb, blending them with Andalusian culture to create new syntheses. The continued interplay between Arab and Berber elements remained central to Moorish identity, even in times of division. As the 11th century progressed, the taifas became increasingly unable to resist the growing power of the Christian kingdoms. The fall of Toledo in 1085 to Alfonso VI of Castile marked a turning point. Toledo had been one of the most important cities of Al-Andalus, rich in history and symbolism. Its loss sent shockwaves through the Muslim world and underscored the vulnerability of the remaining taifas. Facing existential threats, many rulers turned to North Africa for aid, inviting the Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty, to intervene. This appeal would bring new forces into the Iberian struggle and temporarily restore Muslim strength, but it also marked a recognition that the taifas alone could not withstand the pressure of the Reconquista. The era of the taifas is often remembered as one of weakness and decline, but this view oversimplifies a complex reality. Politically fragmented, yes, but culturally vibrant, militarily vulnerable, yet economically resilient. The taifas represent both the fragility and the adaptability of Moorish civilization. They demonstrated the capacity of local rulers to sustain their societies amid chaos, the ability of culture to flourish even in times of political instability, and the tragic reality that disunity can undermine even the most brilliant of civilizations. The fragmentation of Al-Andalus did not extinguish the flame of Moorish culture, but it did expose it to winds of change that would reshape its destiny. The arrival of the Almoravids, and later the Almohads, would inject new energy into the struggle, uniting North African and Andalusian Muslims in defence of their lands. Yet the memory of the Taifa kingdoms, with their brilliance and their vulnerability, remained as a lesson in both the heights of cultural refinement and the costs of political division. From the mosaic of Taifa courts, the story of the Moors moves to the arrival of new powers from across the sea, reformers and warriors who sought to restore unity and discipline. The Almoravids, with their stern religious vision and military strength, would reshape the landscape of Al-Andalus, binding it once more to the destiny of North Africa. When the Taifa kingdom struggled to maintain their fragile existence in the face of advancing Christian power, they looked across the narrow waters of the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa. There, a new force had arisen among the Berber tribes of the desert, a movement both religious and military, disciplined and uncompromising, that sought to purify Islam and expand its reach. These were the Almoravids, a dynasty whose very name evokes their origins in the Ribats, fortified monasteries where warriors combined ascetic devotion with military training. To the divided and vulnerable rulers of Al-Andalus, the Almoravids appeared as saviours, capable of restoring unity and strength. To the Christian kingdoms pressing southward, they became formidable adversaries. To the history of the Moors, they marked a new chapter in which North Africa and Iberia were bound even more tightly together, reshaping the destiny of Al-Andalus through religious reform and military revival. The origins of the Almoravids lay in the Western Sahara, among the Sanhaja Berbers, a confederation of tribes whose territory stretched across the deserts of present-day Mauritania and southern Morocco. In the mid-11th century, a reform movement emerged under the leadership of Abdallah ibn Yasin, a scholar and preacher who sought to purify the faith of the desert tribes. Ibn Yasin called for strict adherence to the Maliki school of Islamic law, emphasizing discipline, moral rigour and communal unity. His followers established ribats, frontier fortresses where warriors lived lives of austerity, prayer and preparation for battle. From these humble beginnings, the Almoravid movement grew into a formidable force, combining religious fervour with military organisation. The Almoravids soon expanded northward, uniting Berber tribes under their banner. They conquered Morocco, establishing Marrakesh as their capital, a city that would grow into one of the great centres of North Africa. Their rule extended into Algeria, and their reputation as disciplined warriors spread. Unlike the Taifa rulers, often accused of indulgence and luxury, the Almoravids projected an image of austerity and piety. They wore distinctive veils that covered their faces, a practice associated with desert life, which gave them a fearsome and otherworldly appearance to outsiders. Their legitimacy rested not only on military success, but on their claim to embody the true spirit of Islam, uncontaminated by the compromises of city life or political intrigue. The connection between the Almoravids and Al-Andalus was forged by necessity. After the fall of Toledo in 1085, the Taifa rulers faced the very real possibility of further Christian advances. Alfonso VI of Castile, emboldened by his conquest, threatened the survival of Moorish Spain. In desperation, the rulers of Seville and other Taifas appealed to Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid leader, to cross into Iberia and assist them. This appeal was not made lightly, for the Taifas knew that by inviting the Almoravids they risked losing their own autonomy. Yet the threat was so great that they judged the risk necessary. Yusuf ibn Tashfin responded, leading an Almoravid army across the Strait of Gibraltar in 1086. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Sagrajas, near Badajoz, where the Almoravid forces, joined by troops from the Taifas, faced Alfonso VI's army. The battle ended in a crushing defeat for the Christians, halting their advance and restoring confidence to the Muslims of Iberia. The victory demonstrated the effectiveness of Almoravid discipline and tactics, contrasting with the disunity of the Taifas. Yusuf returned to North Africa after the battle, but the precedent was set. The Almoravids were now deeply involved in the fate of Al-Andalus. In the years that followed, the Almoravids returned repeatedly, eventually absorbing the Taifa kingdoms into their empire. By 1094 they had annexed Seville, Badajoz, Granada, and other centres, reducing local rulers to insignificance. Córdoba, the old capital, came under their control, and by the early 12th century Al-Andalus was effectively part of the Almoravid state, which stretched from the Sahara to the Ebro River. This integration brought stability and unity, qualities sorely lacking in the Taifa era. It also meant that the fate of Iberia and North Africa were now inseparable, bound together under a single dynasty that ruled both shores of the Western Mediterranean. The Almoravids' rule in Al-Andalus was characterised by religious reform as much as military revival. They enforced stricter adherence to Islamic law, curbing practices they deemed lax or corrupt. Wine, music and poetry, hallmarks of Taifa courts, were suppressed or heavily restricted. Luxuries and displays of extravagance were discouraged. Judges and scholars were appointed to enforce Maliki orthodoxy, ensuring that law and daily life aligned with religious precepts. For many in Al-Andalus, accustomed to the more relaxed and cosmopolitan culture of the Taifas, this new austerity was unwelcome. Yet for others, it represented a return to discipline and moral clarity, a renewal of the Islamic foundations of their society. Militarily, the Almoravids restored the balance of power. Their disciplined armies, drawn from Berber tribes and organised with strict hierarchy, proved effective against Christian advances. They fortified frontiers, garrisoned cities, and conducted campaigns that pushed back the Reconquista. Though they could not eliminate the Christian threat, they stabilised the situation and preserved Al-Andalus for another generation. Their control of North Africa ensured a steady supply of soldiers and resources, giving them an advantage over the fragmented Christian states. Economically, the Almoravids benefited from their position astride trade routes. They controlled the trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt and slaves, as well as Mediterranean commerce. Marrakesh flourished as a centre of administration and culture, while Andalusian cities regained stability under their rule. The influx of West African gold enriched their coffers, enabling them to finance armies and public works. Yet their austerity limited their patronage of the arts compared to the Taifas, and their cultural contributions, though not negligible, were less dazzling than their predecessors. The Almoravids' rule was not without challenges. Their austerity alienated many Andalusians, especially elites who had enjoyed the sophistication of Taifa courts. Their Berber identity, while a source of pride, sometimes clashed with Arab and Iberian sensibilities. Internal dissent and resistance from local populations weakened their grip. Meanwhile, new forces were rising in North Africa. The Almohads, another Berber movement, even more zealous in their religious reform, would eventually supplant them. By the mid-12th century, the Almoravid dynasty was in decline, challenged both in Africa and in Iberia. Their initial vigour gave way to complacency, and their inability to adapt to changing circumstances eroded their strength. Yet their legacy remained significant. They had halted the Christian advance at a critical moment, preserved Al-Andalus from collapse after the fall of Toledo, and demonstrated the capacity of North African Berber dynasties to shape the destiny of Iberia. Their emphasis on religious reform set the stage for later movements, while their integration of the two shores of the Mediterranean highlighted the interconnectedness of Moorish civilization. The Almoravids thus represent both renewal and limitation. They revived the military fortunes of the Moors, imposed discipline and unity, and reasserted the authority of Islamic law. Yet their rigidity also alienated the diverse society of Al-Andalus, curbing the cultural vibrancy that had characterized earlier periods. Their story is one of balance, between austerity and sophistication, between unity and diversity, between revival and decline. As their power waned, a new movement arose in the Maghreb, one that claimed an even stricter vision of Islam, one that sought not only to reform but to transform. The Almohads, emerging from the Atlas Mountains, would cross the strait as the Almoravids had done before them, bringing with them new philosophies, new laws, and a new vision of empire. The history of the Moors thus moved into another phase, where the legacy of reform and revival would be carried forward, reshaped by a new dynasty determined to impose its will on both Africa and Iberia. The The decline of the Almoravids did not mean the decline of Moorish civilization. It meant the passing of authority from one reforming Berber dynasty to another, for the Maghreb in the 12th century produced successive waves of religiously inspired movements that claimed the right to purify Islam and impose a stricter unity. Out of the Atlas Mountains of Morocco emerged the Almohads, a movement even more radical in its theology, and even more ambitious in its imperial designs than the Almoravids before them. Where the Almoravids had stressed discipline and Maliki orthodoxy, the Almohads advanced a sweeping vision of philosophy, theology, and law that sought to reshape not only the Maghreb and Al-Andalus, but the very understanding of Islam itself. The name Almohad derives from the Arabic al-Muwahhidun, meaning the Unitarians, a reference to their central theological claim of the absolute unity of God. They emerged in the early 12th century under the leadership of Ibn Tumart, a Berber from the Masmuda tribes of the High Atlas. Ibn Tumart travelled widely in the Islamic world, studying theology in Baghdad, encountering Ashurite philosophy, and imbibing reformist zeal. Returning to Morocco, he denounced the Almoravids for what he considered their anthropomorphic conception of God, their rigid legalism, and their failure to uphold the true principles of Tawhid, the uncompromising unity of the divine. Declaring himself the Mahdi, the divinely guided one, Ibn Tumart founded a movement that combined strict monotheism with political militancy. The Almohads began as a small band of followers in the Atlas Mountains, but their message resonated widely. They called for a return to simplicity and moral rigour, criticising the luxury and corruption they perceived in Almoravid society. Their theology was intellectually sophisticated, influenced by the rationalist traditions of Islamic philosophy, yet their appeal was also deeply practical, offering a new sense of purpose and unity to Berber tribes fragmented by rivalries. Ibn Tumart's charisma and organisational skill created a disciplined movement, structured around communal living, shared resources, and absolute loyalty to the Mahdi. After Ibn Tumart's death in 1130, leadership passed to his successor Abd al-Mu'min, who transformed the Almohad movement from a religious sect into a powerful state. Abd al-Mu'min was both a skilled general and a shrewd administrator. He united the Berber tribes of the Maghreb under Almohad rule, overthrew the Almoravids, and established Marrakesh as the capital of a new empire. By mid-century, the Almohads controlled Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, creating a North African power that rivaled the great dynasties of the Islamic world. Their ambitions, however, extended beyond Africa, for the fate of Al-Andalus was inseparable from their own. In Iberia, the Almohads arrived as the Almoravids had before them, summoned by the need to defend Moorish Spain against Christian advance. By the 1140s, the Taifa kingdoms had re-emerged after Almoravid decline, and Christian forces pressed southward, capturing key cities. The fall of Lisbon to the Portuguese in 1147, part of the broader momentum of the Reconquista, highlighted the urgency of the situation. The Almohads crossed the strait, bringing with them disciplined armies and a strict religious vision. They quickly asserted control over Al-Andalus, absorbing the Taifas into their empire and imposing their authority with characteristic severity. The Almohads were not merely military rulers, they sought to impose their theological and legal vision on the societies they governed. In contrast to the Almoravids' Maliki orthodoxy, the Almohads advanced a more rationalist theology, influenced by the philosophy of Ibn Tumart and the intellectual traditions of Kalam. They emphasized the use of reason in understanding faith, rejecting anthropomorphic depictions of God, and insisting on pure monotheism. This theological rigour was matched by legal strictness. Judges were expected to uphold Almohad interpretations, and deviations were harshly punished. The Almohads also demanded conversion from Jews and Christians in certain periods, reversing the more tolerant policies of earlier dynasties. This uncompromising approach won them both adherents and enemies, shaping the religious life of Al-Andalus in ways that reverberated for centuries. Culturally, the Almohad period was paradoxical. On the one hand, their austerity and intolerance curtailed some of the cosmopolitan vibrancy of earlier Andalusian life. On the other hand, their patronage of philosophy, science and architecture produced remarkable achievements. Marrakesh flourished under their rule, adorned with monumental buildings such as the Koutoubia Mosque, with its iconic minaret that inspired later towers in Seville and Rabat. In Al-Andalus, they constructed the Giralda in Seville and expanded the Alcazar, leaving behind some of the most enduring monuments of Moorish architecture. Their style emphasized bold geometry, massive proportions, and an austere grandeur that reflected their vision of divine unity. Philosophy under the Almohads reached a peak in the work of Ibn Rushd, or Averroes. Though not himself an Almohad ideologue, Ibn Rushd thrived under their patronage in the 12th century. A native of Córdoba, he produced commentaries on Aristotle that became central to both Islamic and European philosophy. Averroes defended the compatibility of reason and revelation, arguing that philosophy was not only permissible, but necessary for a proper understanding of faith. His works, translated into Latin, shaped the course of scholasticism in Europe, influencing Thomas Aquinas and others. The irony is striking. A dynasty often remembered for its intolerance became the context in which one of the greatest exponents of rationalism flourished, a reminder of the complexities of Almohad rule. The Almohads' imperial expansion was remarkable. At their height, their empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco across North Africa to Libya, and from the Sahara to the Ebro River in Spain. This vast realm was administered with relative efficiency, thanks to a system of provincial governors, religious judges and military commanders who enforced Almohad authority. The unity of Africa and Iberia under a single dynasty reinforced the trans-Mediterranean character of Moorish civilization, binding the fate of Al-Andalus to developments in the Maghreb more closely than ever. Yet the Almohads' ambitions also brought them into constant conflict. In Iberia, they faced the growing strength of the Christian kingdoms. Their greatest military triumph came at the Battle of Alarcos in 1195, when Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur decisively defeated the forces of Castile, temporarily halting the Reconquista and restoring Muslim confidence. But their greatest defeat came less than 2 decades later at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. There, a coalition of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and crusading forces from across Europe dealt a crushing blow to Almohad power. The battle marked the turning point of the Reconquista, after which Muslim power in Iberia steadily declined. The decline of the Almohads mirrored that of the Almoravids before them. Their initial vigour gave way to complacency, internal divisions weakened their unity, and external pressures proved insurmountable. In North Africa, rival dynasties rose to challenge them, while in Iberia their authority collapsed after Las Navas. By the mid-13th century their empire had disintegrated, replaced by smaller states and new powers. In Al-Andalus, the Nasrid dynasty of Granada would rise from the ruins, preserving Moorish presence for 2 more centuries, but the era of Almohad dominance was over. The legacy of the Almohads is complex. They were reformers who sought to purify faith, yet their intolerance alienated many. They were conquerors who united vast territories, yet their empire proved fragile. They were patrons of philosophy and architecture, yet their zeal sometimes curtailed cultural diversity. Their insistence on the unity of God and the use of reason left a mark on Islamic theology and philosophy, while their monuments continue to shape the skylines of cities across Spain and Morocco. The story of the Almohads is thus a story of ambition and limitation, of vision and contradiction. They embodied the capacity of Berber movements to transform the Islamic West, to impose new orders, and to shape the destiny of Al-Andalus. Yet they also reveal the difficulty of sustaining unity in a world of diverse peoples, competing dynasties, and relentless external pressure. Their rise and fall highlight the dynamic interplay between philosophy, law, and empire, a triad that defined their identity and their fate. From the Almohad period, the history of the Moors moves into its final great chapter, the emergence of the Nasrid dynasty in Granada, the last Muslim state in Iberia. If the Almoravids represented revival, and the Almohads represented reform, the Nasrids would represent endurance, a fragile but brilliant survival that carried the Moorish legacy into its final centuries on European soil. The fall of Almohad power after the catastrophic defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 marked a turning point, not only for the dynasty itself, but for the entire Moorish presence in Iberia. The battle shattered the illusion of Muslim invincibility and gave Christian kingdoms the momentum they needed to press southward with renewed determination. Cities fell one by one: Córdoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, Seville in 1248, leaving only fragments of Al-Andalus still under Muslim control. Out of these fragments arose the last great Moorish state on European soil, the Kingdom of Granada. For more than 2.5 centuries, under the rule of the Nasrid dynasty, Granada would endure as the final stronghold of Moorish civilization in Iberia. Its survival owed as much to diplomacy and pragmatism as to military strength, but during its long twilight, the kingdom produced some of the most exquisite cultural achievements of Al-Andalus, leaving a legacy that still defines the memory of the Moors. The founder of the Nasrid dynasty was Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr, known as Muhammad Riyam, who established himself in Granada in 1232. He was a skilled politician, navigating the dangerous waters of a peninsula increasingly dominated by Christian power. By recognizing the authority of Ferdinand III of Castile and agreeing to pay tribute, Muhammad secured the survival of his fledgling state. This pragmatism would become a hallmark of Nasrid rule. Granada endured not by direct confrontation with stronger Christian kingdoms, but by striking a delicate balance of submission and independence, tribute and autonomy, diplomacy and resistance. The geography of Granada favoured defence. Nestled against the Sierra Nevada mountains and protected by rugged terrain, the city of Granada was easier to defend than the wide plains of Andalusia. Its position allowed the Nasrids to maintain a defensible stronghold, even as Christian armies advanced elsewhere. The fertile plain of the Vega provided agricultural abundance, sustaining the population and supporting trade. Ports on the Mediterranean, such as Almeria and Malaga, gave access to maritime commerce and links to North Africa. Geography alone could not guarantee survival, but it provided the foundation upon which Nasrid rulers built their strategies. The Nasrids ruled from the Alhambra, the palace-fortress complex that became the crowning jewel of Moorish architecture. Begun by Muhammad the Failed and expanded by his successors, the Alhambra symbolized both the fragility and the brilliance of the Nasrid kingdom. Its walls enclosed not only fortifications but also palaces, gardens, courts and fountains, embodying the Andalusian aesthetic in its most refined form. The intricate stucco work, the arabesques, the calligraphy, the delicate muqarnas vaulting, all testified to a culture that, though besieged, continued to produce beauty of unparalleled sophistication. The Alhambra was not merely a residence of kings. It was a statement of identity, a proclamation that Moorish civilization still flourished even in its twilight. Politically, the Nasrid dynasty was characterized by both resilience and instability. The rulers of Granada skillfully played Christian kingdoms against each other, exploiting rivalries between Castile and Aragon or between Castile and internal nobles. By offering tribute, marriage alliances or military support, they secured breathing space. At times, they even allied with Christian monarchs against Muslim rivals or rebellious factions within their own realm. This flexibility allowed Granada to survive long after more powerful states had fallen, yet it also bred internal weakness, as rival claimants to the throne, court intrigues, and popular discontent frequently destabilized the kingdom. Assassinations, coups, and civil wars were common, weakening Granada even as it struggled to defend itself from external enemies. Despite these challenges, Granada became a centre of culture and commerce. Its economy was sustained by agriculture, particularly the cultivation of silk, which became a major export. Granadan silk, renowned for its quality, was traded across the Mediterranean, reaching markets in Italy, North Africa, and the Middle East. The kingdom also benefited from its position in Mediterranean trade networks, serving as an intermediary between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. Merchants, artisans, and scholars flocked to Granada, enriching its society with diversity and dynamism. The intellectual life of Granada reflected both continuity and adaptation. Scholars continued to study Islamic law, philosophy, and science, though often under the shadow of decline. Poetry flourished, expressing themes of love, loss, and the fragility of life. Many poets wrote with a sense of melancholy, aware that they lived in the final chapter of Al-Andalus. Their verses celebrated beauty but also lamented impermanence, capturing the poignancy of a civilization in twilight. Music, too, thrived, with Andalusian traditions blending with North African influences to create forms that would endure long after Granada's fall. Granada's survival was also tied to its connections with North Africa. The Nasrids often relied on the support of the Marinid dynasty in Morocco, who provided military aid against Christian advances. These ties reinforced the trans-Mediterranean character of Moorish civilization, ensuring that Granada was not an isolated remnant, but part of a broader Islamic world. Yet dependence on external powers also created vulnerabilities, as the fortunes of Granada were linked to the shifting politics of the Maghreb. The 15th century brought mounting pressures. The Christian kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, grew stronger, while Granada became increasingly divided by internal strife. The union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 created a powerful alliance dedicated to completing the Reconquista. Meanwhile, Granada's rulers engaged in destructive civil wars, most notably the conflict between Muhammad VII, known as Boabdil, and his father and uncle, which fractured the kingdom at the very moment it needed unity. The final act of the Nasrid dynasty unfolded in the late 15th century. Ferdinand and Isabella launched a determined campaign against Granada in 1482, exploiting its divisions and systematically capturing its towns and fortresses. The war lasted a decade, marked by sieges, negotiations, and betrayals. Boabdil, caught between his obligations to his Christian overlords and his responsibilities to his people, became a tragic figure. In 1491, with Granada surrounded and resistance exhausted, he surrendered the city to the Catholic monarchs. On January 2, 1492, the last Muslim ruler of Iberia handed over the keys of the Alhambra, ending nearly 8 centuries of Moorish presence in Spain. The fall of Granada was both an end and a beginning, and for the Moors, it marked the loss of their final stronghold, the extinguishing of political power in Iberia. For Spain, it marked the completion of the Reconquista and the consolidation of a united Christian kingdom. Yet the legacy of Granada endured in its monuments, its art, its poetry, and its memory. The Alhambra remained as a testament to the brilliance of Moorish civilization, its walls whispering of a culture that had reached the heights of beauty, even in the face of decline. The Nasrid dynasty, fragile yet enduring, pragmatic yet cultured, represents the resilience of the Moors in their final centuries. Granada was not a golden age like Córdoba, nor an empire like the Almoravids or Almohads, but a twilight kingdom that preserved the flame of Moorish identity until the very end. Its survival for over 2 centuries in the face of overwhelming odds is itself remarkable, a testament to the adaptability and creativity of its rulers and people. From the fall of Granada, the story of the Moors moves into a darker chapter, the fate of those who remained, the Moriscos, who were forced to navigate life under Christian rule, facing conversion, persecution, and ultimately expulsion. The political kingdom was gone, but the human legacy of the Moors remained, carrying their culture into new forms and leaving traces that would shape Spain and Europe for generations. Even as Granada surrendered in 1492 and the political power of the Moors in Iberia came to an end, The cultural legacy they had woven over centuries continued to resonate. The Moors had left their mark on architecture and science, on trade and governance, but perhaps their most enduring influence lay in the realms of music, poetry, and literature. These were the expressions of the heart and the imagination, the ways in which a civilization spoke of its deepest longings, its joys, its sorrows, and its visions of beauty. In the songs that echoed in palaces and taverns, in the verses inscribed on the walls of the Alhambra, in the manuscripts that carried ideas across continents, the voice of the Moors still speaks. The contribution of the Moors to music in medieval Europe is profound. From the moment Ziryab arrived in Córdoba in the 9th century, carrying with him the traditions of the Abbasid court in Baghdad, the musical life of Al-Andalus was transformed. Ziryab introduced new instruments, new modes, and new styles of performance. He expanded the oud, the ancestor of the European lute, by adding a 5th string, broadening its range and deepening its expressive possibilities. He introduced refined techniques of composition, organizing musical performance into structured suites that balanced improvisation with discipline. His innovations in rhythm and melody shaped not only Andalusian music, but also influenced the musical traditions of Christian Spain and beyond. The Andalusian musical tradition that emerged from this synthesis endured long after the fall of Moorish Spain. Known as muwashsha and zajal, these poetic and musical forms blended Arabic, Berber, and Romance elements, creating songs that spoke to diverse audiences. The muwashsha, with its elaborate structure and themes of love, nature, and longing, became one of the most distinctive expressions of Andalusian culture. The zajal, often more popular and accessible, employed vernacular language and lively rhythms, anticipating later traditions of popular song. These forms influenced not only medieval European music, but also continued to live on in North Africa, where they became foundational to the Andalusian musical heritage still performed today in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Instruments carried by the Moors into Iberia also shaped European music. The oud evolved into the lute, one of the central instruments of Renaissance music. The qanun, a type of zither, influenced European string instruments. Percussion instruments introduced by the Moors enriched rhythmic possibilities. Even the concept of musical notation and theory was advanced through contacts with Moorish scholars who drew on Greek traditions preserved in the Islamic world. The result was a profound transformation of European music, one that cannot be understood without acknowledging the Moorish contribution. If music was the sound of Moorish culture, poetry was its voice. From the earliest days of Al-Andalus, poetry flourished in courts and marketplaces, in mosques and private gatherings. The Moors inherited the classical Arabic tradition, with its odes and elegies, but they adapted it to the landscapes and emotions of Iberia. Poets wrote of gardens and rivers, of love and loss, of philosophy and faith. Their verses captured the sensual beauty of Andalusian life, the scent of orange blossoms, the play of light on water, the melancholy of exile, the joy of companionship. Poetry was not confined to elite circles. It permeated society, recited in gatherings, sung in songs, inscribed on walls. The development of the muwashsha as a poetic form exemplifies this creativity. Emerging in Al-Andalus in the 9th or 10th century, it broke from the rigid structures of classical Arabic poetry, employing strophic verses and often ending with a khaja, a short refrain in colloquial Arabic or Romance. This blending of languages reflected the multicultural reality of Al-Andalus, where Arabic, Berber, Latin and Romance tongues coexisted. The muwashsha was both refined and popular, bridging the worlds of high art and common expression. It became one of the most influential forms of medieval poetry, inspiring later European lyric traditions. Poets such as Ibn Hazm, Ibn Kuzman, and Walada bint al-Mustakfi exemplify the richness of Andalusian poetry. Ibn Hazm, known not only as a poet but as a philosopher and theologian, wrote The Ring of the Dove, a treatise on love that remains one of the most remarkable explorations of human affection in world literature. Combining personal experience with philosophical reflection, it demonstrates the depth and sensitivity of Moorish literary culture. Ibn Quzman, writing in the 12th century, specialised in zajal, composing lively and earthy poems that captured the rhythms of everyday life. Walida, a princess of Córdoba in the 11th century, was both a poet and a patron of poets, her verses expressing independence, wit and passion. Together these figures reveal a literary culture that was diverse, vibrant and profoundly human. The inscriptions of poetry and architecture further demonstrate its centrality. In the Alhambra, verses adorn walls, fountains and arches, turning the palace into a living poem. The words speak of beauty, of divine glory, of the fleeting nature of life, merging text and space in a unique artistic synthesis. To walk through the Alhambra is to be enveloped in poetry, to experience architecture not only as structure but as verse-made stone. This integration of poetry and environment was one of the hallmarks of the Andalusian aesthetic. Literature in prose was equally significant. The Moors contributed to philosophy, history, theology and storytelling. Philosophers such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Tufayl wrote works that combined rigorous reasoning with imaginative narrative. Ibn Tufayl's Hayy ibn Yaqzan, for example, is a philosophical novel about a child raised alone on a desert island, who discovers truth through reason and observation. The work explores themes of knowledge, revelation, and the relationship between reason and faith. Translated into Latin, it influenced European thought, anticipating elements of Enlightenment philosophy. Historical works, such as those of Ibn Hayyan, recorded the events of Al-Andalus with detail and reflection, preserving memory for future generations. The transmission of knowledge through literature was one of the greatest legacies of the Moors. Manuscripts copied in Andalusian script circulated across the Mediterranean, carrying ideas in science, medicine, philosophy and art. Libraries in Córdoba, Granada and Seville housed tens of thousands of volumes, serving as repositories of human thought. Even as political fortunes declined, the literary tradition endured, ensuring that the voices of the Moors would continue to be heard. The influence of Moorish literature extended beyond the Islamic world. Through translation movements in Toledo and other cities, works of philosophy, science and literature entered Latin Europe. The poetry of Al-Andalus, though less directly transmitted, inspired troubadour traditions in Provence and lyric poetry in Spain and Italy. Themes of courtly love, so central to medieval European literature, bear the imprint of Andalusian forms. The blending of sensuality, spirituality and melancholy in Moorish poetry found echoes in the works of Dante, Petrarch and later writers, shaping the evolution of the European literature. Music, poetry and literature thus represent not only the artistic achievements of the Moors, but also their deepest legacy. These forms carried the spirit of Al-Andalus across boundaries and centuries, influencing cultures far beyond their own. They reveal a civilization that, even in its decline, continued to create, to imagine, and to express beauty in ways that outlived its political structures. The contribution of the Moors in these realms cannot be separated from the broader story of coexistence and conflict in Iberia. They drew upon Arabic, Berber, Jewish and Christian traditions, creating syntheses that reflected the complexity of their society. Their songs and verses were born of gardens and battles, of faith and doubt, of joy and sorrow. They remind us that civilizations are remembered not only for their conquests or their monuments, but for their voices, the sounds and words through which they expressed their humanity. From the poetry inscribed on palace walls to the melodies that shaped European instruments, from the treatises on love and philosophy to the vernacular songs of the streets, the Moors enriched the cultural fabric of Iberia and beyond. Their music, poetry and literature remain as echoes of a world that no longer exists, yet whose influence continues to shape the present. From this cultural brilliance, however, the narrative turns again to politics and conflict. For while the Moors created songs and verses of lasting beauty, they also faced the relentless advance of Christian power. the gradual contraction of their territory, and the final struggles that would bring an end to their presence in Iberia. The Reconquista was moving toward its culmination, and the Moors would face not only military defeat but also the challenge of survival in a world where their place was increasingly precarious. The story of the Moors cannot be told without its counterpart, the centuries-long process by which Christian kingdoms in the north of Iberia gradually reclaimed the peninsula from Muslim rule. Known as the Reconquista, this struggle was not a single continuous campaign, but a long and uneven process, spanning nearly 8 centuries, marked by advances and setbacks, truces and wars, coexistence and conflict. For the Moors, the Reconquista was the defining challenge, the backdrop against which their entire history in Iberia unfolded. From the first Christian resistance in the mountains of Asturias to the final surrender of Granada in 1492, the Reconquista charted the gradual contraction of Moorish Spain until nothing remained but memory and legacy. The origins of the Reconquista lay in the aftermath of the initial Muslim conquest of Iberia in the early 8th century. While most of the peninsula fell swiftly, small pockets of resistance endured in the rugged northern mountains. In Asturias, a Christian leader named Pelayo is said to have won a minor but symbolically significant victory at the Battle of Covadonga around 722. Though modest in scale, this event later took on legendary importance as the beginning of Christian resistance, the seed from which the Reconquista would grow. Over the following centuries, Christian communities in Asturias, León, Navarre and Catalonia gradually consolidated their positions, building kingdoms that would one day challenge Moorish power. For much of the early medieval period, however, the balance of power favoured the Moors. The Umayyad Emirate and later Caliphate of Córdoba represented a centralised, prosperous and culturally advanced state, while the Christian kingdoms were fragmented, small, and often preoccupied with their own rivalries. The Reconquista advanced only slowly, often limited to border skirmishes and occasional conquests. Yet the Christians persisted, drawing strength from their belief in the righteousness of their cause and from their ability to exploit divisions within Al-Andalus. The fragmentation of Moorish Spain after the fall of the Caliphate in the 11th century created new opportunities. The Taifa kingdoms, though culturally brilliant, were politically weak and militarily vulnerable. Christian rulers took advantage of this weakness, launching campaigns to capture key cities. Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, fell to Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085, a major milestone that shifted the balance of power. The Taifas, unable to resist, often paid tribute to Christian kings in the form of parias, a system that drained their resources while enriching their adversaries. The Reconquista in this period was as much about economic pressure as military conquest, with tribute fueling the growth of Christian states. The arrival of the Almoravids in the late 11th century temporarily halted Christian advances. Their victory at the Battle of Segrillas in 1086 reminded the Christians that Moorish power, backed by North African reinforcements, remained formidable. Yet the Almoravids, and later the Almohads, faced their own challenges, including internal dissent and external rivals. Their interventions prolonged the life of Al-Andalus but could not reverse the overall trajectory of the Reconquista. The 12th and 13th centuries marked decisive shifts. The Christian kingdoms grew stronger, uniting more effectively and benefiting from economic expansion and demographic growth. Military orders, such as the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, provided disciplined warriors dedicated to the Reconquista, blending religious fervour with martial skill. The capture of key cities accelerated. Zaragoza fell in 1118 to the forces of Aragon, and Lisbon was taken by the Portuguese in 1147 with the help of crusaders en route to the Holy Land. The tide was turning. The decisive moment came in 1212 at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. A coalition of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and crusading forces from across Europe confronted the Almohads in one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages. The Christian victory was overwhelming, shattering Almohad power in Iberia and opening the way for rapid advances. In the following decades, Córdoba fell in 1236, Valencia in 1238, and Seville in 1240. By the mid-13th century, only the Kingdom of Granada remained under Moorish rule. The Reconquista had reduced Al-Andalus to a single fragile state, dependent on diplomacy and tribute to survive. Granada endured for over 2 centuries, but its survival did not alter the long-term trend. The Christian kingdoms continued to expand, consolidating their power and resources. The union of Castile and Aragon through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469 created a powerful state determined to complete the Reconquista. Their combined resources, coupled with the weakening of Granada through internal strife, made the end inevitable. The final war against Granada, launched in 1482, was a systematic campaign of sieges and conquests that gradually stripped the Nasrid kingdom of its territory. In 1492, the city of Granada fell, and with it the last remnant of Moorish Spain. The Reconquista was not only a military process but also a cultural and religious one. As Christian power advanced, Muslim and Jewish communities faced increasing pressures. In some areas, coexistence continued for generations, with Muslims living as mudejars under Christian rule, retaining aspects of their culture and religion. Yet over time, policies grew harsher, culminating in forced conversions, expulsions, and persecution. The Reconquista was part of the broader effort to create a unified Christian identity in Iberia, an effort that intensified after 1492 with the expulsion of Jews and the forced conversion of Muslims, creating the community known as Moriscos. The gradual fall of Moorish Spain was thus not only the loss of territory, but the erosion of a way of life. The convivencia, the coexistence of Muslims, Christians and Jews that had characterized much of Al-Andalus, gave way to an increasingly rigid orthodoxy. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that had enriched Iberia diminished, replaced by efforts to suppress diversity. Yet even as Moorish political power disappeared, the legacy of their civilization remained, woven into the fabric of Spanish society in language, architecture, music, and memory. The Reconquista also had broader consequences. It forged the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon and Portugal into powerful states, setting the stage for the age of exploration. The same year Granada fell, 1492, Columbus sailed west under the sponsorship of Ferdinand and Isabella, linking the completion of the Reconquista with the opening of the New World. The resources, institutions, and ideological zeal forged in centuries of conflict with the Moors were redirected outward, fueling the rise of Spain as a global power. The fall of Moorish Spain thus marked not only the end of one era, but the beginning of another. For the Moors, the Reconquista was a story of resilience and loss. For centuries they resisted, adapted and endured, creating a civilization of remarkable brilliance even as their territory shrank. Their gradual fall was not a sudden collapse but a long twilight, marked by both tragedy and creativity. The Reconquista defines their history not only as a tale of defeat, but also as a testament to their ability to create beauty and knowledge in the shadow of decline. From the culmination of the Reconquista, the story moves to the final fate of the Moors who remained in Spain, the Moriscos. Stripped of their political power, they faced the challenge of survival under Christian rule, negotiating identities, enduring persecution, and ultimately facing expulsion. The history of the Moors did not end with Granada's fall. It continued in the lives of those who carried their heritage into the new and difficult world of post-Reconquista Spain. The year 1492 occupies a unique place in world history. For Spain, it was the year of triumph, the culmination of the Reconquista, and the birth of a united Christian kingdom that immediately turned its gaze outward toward the Atlantic. For Europe, it was the year when Columbus crossed the ocean, linking continents in ways that would reshape the globe. But for the Moors of Iberia, it was the year of loss, the year when the last bastion of their once vast presence surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella. The fall of Granada was more than the transfer of a city. It was the end of nearly 8 centuries of Moorish political authority in Iberia, and it marked the beginning of a new and often tragic chapter in their history. The final act of Granada's resistance had been long and painful. Beginning in 1482, Ferdinand and Isabella launched a methodical campaign to dismantle the Nasrid kingdom piece by piece. Castles and towns fell one after another as Christian armies advanced with determination, fueled by the wealth of Castile and the organisational skill of their monarchs. The war was not only a military endeavour, but also a symbolic crusade, sanctioned by the papacy and supported by volunteers from across Europe, who saw in it the chance to fight for Christendom. For the Catholic monarchs, the conquest of Granada was not merely territorial, it was a religious mission, the capstone of centuries of Christian reconquest. The internal divisions of Granada played into their hands. The Nasrid dynasty was fractured by civil war, with rival claimants to the throne weakening the kingdom's ability to resist. Muhammad Afond, known as Boabdil, was caught in a web of conflicting loyalties, alternately allied with and opposed to his father and uncle. His attempts to balance survival with resistance often led him to negotiate with Ferdinand and Isabella, undermining his own legitimacy. By the late 1480s, Granada was surrounded, its resources exhausted, and its people weary of war. The final siege of Granada began in the spring of 1491. The Christian armies encircled the city, cutting off supplies and tightening their grip. Ferdinand and Isabella established a military camp nearby, which they called Santa Fe, symbolising the holy faith that justified their campaign. This camp, organised like a permanent town with streets and churches, underscored their determination to complete the conquest. Inside Granada, food shortages and despair eroded morale. The population, once proud of their city's resilience, now faced hunger and the inevitability of defeat. On November 25, 1491, the capitulations of Granada were signed, outlining the terms of surrender. These terms promised generous treatment for the Muslim population. The Moors were to be allowed to practice their religion freely, to retain their mosques, laws and customs, and to live under their own officials. Property was to be respected and no forced conversions were to occur. The capitulations represented a pragmatic recognition by Ferdinand and Isabella that the peaceful integration of Granada's population was preferable to prolonged resistance. For the Moors, the terms offered hope that their way of life could continue under new rulers. On January 2nd, 1492, Boabdil surrendered the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Catholic monarchs entered the city in triumph, while Boabdil departed in exile, accompanied by his family and a small retinue. Legend holds that as he paused on a hill overlooking Granada, he wept at the sight of the city he had lost, prompting his mother to chide him, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." Whether or not this exchange actually occurred, it captured the pathos of the moment, the end of Moorish rule, the loss of a civilization's heart, the sorrow of exile. The fate of the Moors after 1492 was far more complex than the capitulations promised. Initially, Ferdinand and Isabella upheld the terms, allowing Muslims to continue their religious and cultural practices. But pressure from the church, from local authorities, and from the broader ideology of religious unity soon eroded these guarantees. Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, the powerful Archbishop of Toledo, pushed for mass conversions, arguing that the presence of Muslims undermined the purity of Christian Spain. By the late 1490s, forced conversions had begun, violating the spirit of the capitulations and signalling the beginning of a harsh new era for the Moors. Those who converted became known as Moriscos, nominal Christians who often continued to practice Islam in secret. Suspicion of their sincerity led to increasing persecution. The Inquisition, established earlier to root out heresy among converted Jews, now turned its attention to the Moriscos, investigating, punishing and terrorizing communities suspected of secretly adhering to Islam. The very act of being a Moor, even one baptized into Christianity, became grounds for suspicion. Over time, the pressure intensified, and the once proud Moorish population was reduced to a marginalized, distrusted minority. For many Moors, exile became the only option. Some crossed the Mediterranean to North Africa, joining communities in Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. Others scattered to the Ottoman Empire, where they found refuge among fellow Muslims. Yet exile was not easy. Many faced poverty, dislocation, and the loss of familiar homes. For those who remained in Spain, life was marked by fear and compromise. They adapted outwardly to Christian practices while clinging inwardly to remnants of their heritage, transmitting culture in whispers and in secret. The fate of the Moors after 1492 illustrates the paradox of conquest and assimilation. Officially, they had been promised tolerance and protection. In reality, they faced coercion and erasure. Yet despite persecution, they left indelible traces in Spanish culture. Their knowledge of agriculture, irrigation, and crafts continued to shape rural life. Their music, poetry, and cuisine left imprints on Spanish traditions. Their architecture remained as monuments admired even by those who despised their faith. The very fabric of Spain was interwoven with Moorish contributions, even as official policy sought to deny or suppress them. The year 1492 thus represents both an end and transition. It ended Moorish political power in Iberia, closing the chapter of Al-Andalus that had begun with Tariq ibn Ziyad's landing 7 centuries earlier. But it also marked the beginning of the Morisco experience, a new chapter in which the Moors survived not as rulers, but as a marginalised community navigating life under Christian dominance. The tragedy of 1492 lies not only in the fall of Granada, but in the broken promises that followed, the betrayal of hopes for coexistence, and the relentless drive toward religious uniformity that erased much of what the Moors had built. Yet even in defeat, the Moors retained a kind of triumph. Their civilization had shaped Iberia so profoundly that it could not be erased. The Alhambra still stood, its walls inscribed with poetry that spoke of beauty and impermanence. The gardens, the songs, the words, the sciences, all continue to echo in Spanish life and in European culture. The end of Granada did not erase the Moorish legacy. It transformed it, embedding it into the heritage of Spain and the wider world. From the surrender of Granada, the story of the Moors moves to the Moriscos, those who remained in Spain after 1492, navigating the harsh realities of forced conversion, persecution, and eventual expulsion. Their fate reveals both the endurance of identity and the cruelty of intolerance, the persistence of heritage and the tragedy of erasure. The fall of Granada in 1492 closed the chapter of Moorish rule in Iberia, but it did not end the presence of the Moors themselves. Tens of thousands remained, bound by ties of land, ancestry and memory to the soil of Spain. They were no longer rulers but subjects, no longer sovereign but dependent on the promises of their conquerors. Those promises, inscribed in the capitulations of Granada, had assured them freedom of religion, protection of property, and the right to live according to their traditions. For a brief moment it seemed possible that the Moors, though defeated, might endure as a distinct and tolerated community within the new Christian kingdom. But that moment passed quickly. Within a decade, the guarantees were eroded, the pressures mounted, and the Moors found themselves forced to choose between exile and conversion. From that choice arose the group known as the Moriscos, Muslims who outwardly embraced Christianity but often maintained their faith in secret, navigating lives of suspicion, persecution, and ultimately expulsion. The initial years after 1492 gave some hope of coexistence. Ferdinand and Isabella, mindful of their promises, allowed the Muslims of Granada to continue practicing Islam under the guidance of their own religious leaders. Mosques remained open, the call to prayer was still heard, and Islamic customs endured. But this uneasy tolerance was fragile. Undermined by pressures from the church, and by the ideology of religious unity that animated the Catholic monarchs. Spain had been forged in the crucible of the Reconquista, its identity tied to the struggle against Islam and Judaism. For many in positions of power, the presence of large Muslim and Jewish populations in a united Christian kingdom was intolerable. The turning point came in the late 1490s, under the influence of Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros. While Archbishop Talavera of Granada had advocated a gradual approach to conversion, emphasizing persuasion and education, Cisneros adopted a harsher stance. He ordered mass baptisms, sometimes under duress, and closed mosques. Resistance broke out in Granada in 1499 as Muslims rose in revolt against these violations of the capitulations. The rebellion was suppressed with force, and in its aftermath the crown declared that all Muslims in Castile must convert or leave. The choice was largely illusory. Most could not abandon their homes, lands and livelihoods, so they accepted baptism. Thus, in a matter of years, the Muslims of Granada and other regions became Moriscos, nominal Christians whose sincerity was always doubted. The conversion of the Moors did not bring acceptance. Suspicion of their faith lingered, and the Inquisition turned its attention to them, as it had earlier to the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. The Moriscos were accused of crypto-Islam, of maintaining their traditions in secret. Reports circulated of families who prayed in Arabic behind closed doors, who avoided eating pork, who washed ritually before prayer, who recited verses of the Quran from memory. These practices, whether real or imagined, became grounds for persecution. Trials, imprisonments, and executions followed, creating a climate of fear. Despite this, the Moriscos preserved elements of their identity. In private, many continued to speak Arabic or al-Jamiado, a form of Castilian written in Arabic script. They maintained customs in dress, cuisine, and family life. They transmitted their heritage through whispered prayers, hidden manuscripts, and oral traditions. This clandestine preservation of identity was an act of resilience, a refusal to let centuries of culture vanish in the face of coercion. Yet it also exposed them to constant danger, as any sign of difference could bring the attention of the Inquisition. The Morisco communities were not uniform. In some regions, particularly in Valencia and Aragon, Moriscos formed large rural populations, working as farmers and labourers. In Granada, they were concentrated in urban neighbourhoods like the Albayzín, where their presence gave the city a distinct character even under Christian rule. In Castile, they were fewer and more dispersed, often integrating more fully into local society. These regional variations shaped their experiences, with some communities maintaining stronger ties to Islamic traditions, while others assimilated more visibly. Economic factors also influenced the fate of the Moriscos. They were often skilled farmers, introducing advanced irrigation techniques and cultivating crops such as rice, citrus fruits, and silk. Their labour was valuable to landlords and to the economy of Spain. This created a paradox. While the Moriscos were distrusted and persecuted for their religion, they were also indispensable in many regions for their economic contributions. Landowners and nobles often defended their presence, not out of sympathy, but out of self-interest. This tension between economic utility and religious suspicion defined much of their history. The 16th century saw repeated crises. In 1568, the Moriscos of Granada rose in the rebellion of the Alpujarras, a desperate attempt to resist assimilation and defend their traditions. Sparked by decrees that banned the use of Arabic, traditional clothing, and other customs, the revolt spread through the mountains of southern Spain. The Moriscos fought fiercely, using guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the terrain to resist royal forces, but the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the armies of Philip II, and its aftermath was devastating. Thousands were killed, enslaved, or displaced. Many surviving Moriscos from Granada were forcibly resettled in Castile and other regions, scattering their communities and weakening their cohesion. Despite repression, the Moriscos endured for several more decades. They continued to live in Spain, outwardly Christian but inwardly distinct, contributing to the economy and culture while navigating a precarious existence. Some assimilated more fully, intermarrying with old Christians and abandoning Islamic practices. Others clung stubbornly to their heritage, preserving fragments of faith in secret. Their survival was a testament to human resilience, but it was also marked by constant fear of exposure and punishment. By the early 17th century, the Spanish crown had grown increasingly determined to resolve what it saw as the Morisco problem. The monarchy faced internal and external pressures, fears of Ottoman incursions from the Mediterranean, suspicions that Moriscos might ally with Muslim corsairs or Protestant enemies, and anxieties about religious unity. The ideology of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, fueled discrimination, portraying Moriscos as irredeemably tainted by their ancestry. Economic arguments also shifted. While some still valued their labour, others resented their prosperity in trade and agriculture. In 1609, King Philip III, influenced by his court and by powerful factions in Spain, decreed the expulsion of the Moriscos. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands were forced to leave, escorted to ports and shipped to North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Estimates vary, but perhaps as many as 300,000 Moriscos were expelled, a massive displacement that reshaped Spanish society. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed, lives uprooted. Many suffered robbery, violence, and death during the expulsion process. For those who reached North Africa, life was often harsh, as they were received with suspicion by local populations and struggled to adapt after generations in Spain. The expulsion of the Moriscos was one of the most tragic episodes in Spanish history. It marked the culmination of a century of persecution, the final attempt to erase the Muslim presence from Iberia. Yet it also deprived Spain of valuable communities, weakening its economy and depopulating rural areas. The loss of skilled farmers, artisans and traders contributed to long-term decline, a bitter irony for a policy driven by fear and intolerance. For the Moriscos themselves, exile was both an end and a beginning. They carried with them fragments of their culture, language and traditions, preserving them in North Africa and the wider Islamic world. Some rose to prominence in their new homes, becoming scholars, merchants or officials. Others lived in obscurity, their descendants gradually assimilating into local societies. The memory of Spain lingered, however, in stories, songs and identities. For generations, Morisco spoke of Al-Andalus as a lost homeland, a place of beauty and sorrow shaping the imagination of the Islamic world. The story of the Moriscos is one of endurance and tragedy. They survived the fall of Granada, endured forced conversion, preserved their identity in secret, rose in revolt, suffered defeat, and were finally expelled. Yet their legacy endured. In the architecture they built, the crops they cultivated, the words they spoke, the songs they sang, the very fabric of Spanish culture. Even in their absence, they remained part of Spain, woven into its history in ways that could not be undone. From the expulsion of the Moriscos, the story of the Moors moves into the realm of memory and legacy. Though their political and communal presence in Spain ended, their influence continued in art, language, architecture and imagination. The Moors may have been expelled, but Al-Andalus remained, not as a state, but as a memory that haunted and inspired, shaping both Spain's identity and Europe's understanding of its past. The story of the Moors as a political force in Iberia ended with the fall of Granada in 1492 and the expulsion of the Moriscos in the early 17th century. Yet their presence did not vanish with their exile. Civilizations do not simply disappear when their armies are defeated or their people dispersed. They endure in memory, in culture, in architecture, in language, and in the subtle ways that societies carry forward the marks of their past. the Moors left a legacy that has outlived their political authority, shaping the history of both Europe and North Africa in ways that remain visible to this day. In Spain itself, the imprint of the Moors is everywhere. Cities that once belonged to Al-Andalus still bear the architectural and cultural traces of their past. The Alhambra in Granada, with its intricate stucco, delicate arches and poetic inscriptions, remains one of the most visited monuments in Europe, a living testament to Moorish artistry. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, with its forest of columns and mesmerising arches, continues to inspire awe even after centuries of serving as a Christian cathedral. The Giralda in Seville, originally built as a minaret by the Almohads, towers over the city as a reminder of the Moorish presence. These structures are not relics confined to history books. They are living parts of the urban landscape, shaping the identity of Spain and drawing millions of visitors who marvel at their beauty. Beyond monumental architecture, the Moors shaped the very patterns of Spanish life. Agricultural techniques introduced during their centuries of rule transformed the countryside. Irrigation systems, terracing, and the cultivation of new crops such as rice, citrus fruits, and pomegranates became staples of Iberian agriculture. Even today, the landscapes of Andalusia, with their groves of oranges and fields of rice, reflect Moorish innovation. The foods of Spain, flavours of saffron, almonds, and spices, bear the unmistakable influence of Moorish cuisine. In every meal, in every orchard, the contributions of the Moors linger. The Spanish language itself carries traces of the Moors. Thousands of words of Arabic origin remain embedded in modern Spanish, particularly in everyday vocabulary and place names. Words like aceituna, olive, azúcar, sugar, acequia, irrigation ditch, ojalá, derived from inshallah, meaning God willing, and countless others are reminders of the centuries when Arabic was the language of power and culture in Iberia. Place names beginning with Guad, from the Arabic wadi, meaning river, dot the map of Spain. Guadalquivir, Guadalajara, Guadix. Even in daily speech, the echo of Al-Andalus continues. The Moorish legacy also shaped the arts and sciences of Europe. Through the translation movements of the 12th and 13th centuries, knowledge preserved and expanded in Al-Andalus entered Latin Christendom. Works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy and others, translated into Arabic and commented upon by scholars like Averroes and Maimonides, reached Europe via Spain. This transmission of knowledge was one of the foundations of the European Renaissance. The intellectual revival that transformed Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries owed much to the channels opened by the Moors. The algebra, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy of Al-Andalus became the building blocks of modern science. The cultural synthesis of Al-Andalus also left its mark on European music and literature. The traditions of troubadour poetry in Provence, with their themes of courtly love, bear clear traces of Andalusian lyric forms like the muasha and zarjal. Musical instruments such as the lute and the rebec, introduced through Moorish influence, became central to European music. The very idea of refined love poetry, with its blend of passion and restraint, can be traced back to the cultural exchanges of Moorish Spain. In this sense, the Moors shaped not only the physical landscapes of Europe, but also its inner landscapes of thought and feeling. In North Africa, the legacy of the Moors is equally profound. The waves of refugees who fled Spain after 1492 and again after the expulsion of the Moriscos carried with them skills, traditions and memories that enriched the societies they joined. In Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, Andalusi refugees founded new communities, bringing agricultural knowledge, artisanal crafts and musical traditions. Cities like Fez and Tetuan became centres of Andalusi culture, their neighbourhoods still known as Andalusian quarters. The music of Andalusia, preserved in North Africa, remains a living tradition, performed in festivals and concerts, its melodies linking the present to the lost world of Al-Andalus. The memory of Al-Andalus also became part of the imagination of the Islamic world. Poets and historians in Morocco, Egypt and the Ottoman Empire wrote nostalgically of the lost paradise of Andalusia, lamenting its fall while celebrating its achievements. The image of Al-Andalus as a golden age of Islamic civilization, a place of learning, beauty and coexistence, became a powerful symbol, shaping identities and aspirations long after its political demise. For many Muslims, Al-Andalus represented not only a lost homeland, but also an ideal of what Islamic civilization could achieve. In modern Europe, the legacy of the Moors is both celebrated and contested. On the one hand, the monuments of Al-Andalus are among the most prized parts of Europe's cultural heritage, attracting millions of visitors and inspiring admiration for the artistry of Moorish civilization. On the other hand, the history of the Moors is entangled with narratives of conquest, religious conflict and identity. For centuries, Spanish national identity was built on the story of the Reconquista, the triumph of Christianity over Islam. Only in recent decades has there been greater recognition of the depth and value of the Moorish contribution to Spain's culture and history. The Moors are no longer seen only as invaders, but also as creators, whose legacy is inseparable from what Spain is today. The endurance of this legacy also raises questions about memory and identity. The Moriscos, expelled in the 17th century, were erased from Spain's official history, yet their influence remains in language, food, music, and custom. The story of the Moors reminds us that identity is not pure or simple, but layered and complex. Spain is not solely the product of Christian Europe, but also of Islamic and Jewish cultures, woven together in centuries of coexistence and conflict. To acknowledge the Moorish legacy is to recognise the plurality at the heart of European history. Beyond Spain, the story of the Moors resonates with broader themes of cultural exchange, migration and identity. Their civilization was a bridge between worlds, linking Africa and Europe, Islam and Christendom, antiquity and modernity. Their fate from conquest to exile speaks to the fragility of tolerance and the costs of intolerance. Their legacy, enduring across continents, demonstrates that ideas, arts, and traditions can outlast political boundaries and shape societies long after states have fallen. The enduring legacy of the Moors in modern Europe and North Africa is therefore not only about monuments and words, but about lessons. It is about the recognition that civilizations are not isolated but interconnected, that human creativity flourishes in diversity, and that the memory of the past shapes the present. The gardens of the Alhambra, the words of Ibn Hazm, the music of Andalusia, the scientific texts of Averroes, all are part of a heritage that belongs not to one people alone, but to the shared history of humanity. The Moors may have lost their kingdoms, their lands, and their political power, but they gained something more enduring, a place in the cultural and intellectual heritage of the world. Their story is not simply one of rise and fall, but of transformation, survival through legacy, endurance through memory. In the stones of Granada, in the words of Spanish speech, in the music of Morocco, in the philosophies of Europe, the Moors still live,